It began quietly, as most contagions do. A bottle passed hand to hand through London's fog. Not a poison, not quite a cure, but something in between. Doctors swore it healed the mind. Poets said it opened doors that were never meant to be opened. And in every parlor, every barracks, every sleepless home, cannabis indica began to whisper its way into the bloodstream of an empire. At first, it soothed. The trembling stopped. The dreams softened. The city slept. But something was stirring beneath that calm and invisible hunger that fed on silence and spread through the body like rumor. The Victorians thought they were taming a plant. They didn't realize the plant was taming them, because night after night, the bottles emptied faster. The doses grew heavier, and what began as medicine became something that watched them back, patient, green, and breathing. So tonight, we open the bottle again, to remember how the empire found its comfort, and how that comfort began to take control. Subscribe and stay with me. More forgotten cures, more forbidden comforts, more nights where medicine started to whisper back. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? The apothecary on Fleet Street never truly slept. Even after the gas lamps were dimmed and the last patient had gone home clutching a brown paper parcel, the room seemed to hum with a kind of nocturnal life. Bottles gleamed faintly on their shelves, each one a promise wrapped in glass laudanum for the restless, ether for the brave, chloroform for the surgeon's hand. And on the highest shelf, catching the reflection of a single wavering flame, stood a new arrival from the east, Extractum Cannabis Indicae. Its label, written in delicate script, bore only 2 words beneath: tincture. Potent. I remember the smell before I noticed the bottle itself, an earthy sweetness, the scent of something sunburned and foreign. The shopkeeper, an old chemist with ink-stained fingers, handled it carefully, as if the glass might whisper secrets. He said it came from Calcutta, distilled by British doctors who had learned its use from Indian healers. A medicine for pain, he murmured, and for the mind that will not sleep. His tone was reverent, like a priest naming a relic. Outside, London was coughing itself to sleep. The city stank of coal and horse dung, of rainwater dripping into the Thames. Inside, the air was thick with herbs, camphor, and curiosity. Every shelf held a different century of hope: foxglove for the heart, belladonna for the nerves, and now this, a green ghost from an empire half a world away. The chemist poured a few drops onto a glass slide, holding it up to the lamp. "See how it glows," he whispered. The liquid caught the light like stained glass at Paul's deep amber with a hint of forest inside. Victorians trusted glass more than God. If suffering could be trapped, labeled, and sold, then perhaps the body could be conquered too. In the age of invention and empire, pain was just another frontier. Cannabis arrived not as rebellion but as refinement, bottled proof that the British Empire could tame even pleasure into medicine. Doctors called it the safe opiate, a cure for sleeplessness, cough, and hysteria. Pharmacists sold it alongside quinine and morphine, while the city's poets whispered of its visions, soft laughter, colors that hummed, thoughts that moved like smoke. But there was something else beneath the calm, something the glass could not contain. In its perfume lingered a strangeness, a softness that unsettled the moral spine of the age. For if the plant could ease the body, what might it do to the soul? The Victorians were a people torn between control and curiosity, forever chasing comfort while fearing what comfort revealed. The chemist replaced the cork and set the bottle back in its place, beside the opium tinctures and cough elixirs, where it would wait for trembling hands and sleepless minds to find it. Outside, the rain began again, fine, silver, endless. Carriages splashed through the puddles as the apothecary locked his door, leaving the green bottle glowing faintly in the dark. Somewhere beyond the window, a mother would soon mix its drops into her child's milk. A soldier, shaking from battle, would take it with tea. A poet would sip and see God in the gaslight. None of them would yet know what they were holding: the empire's newest cure, and its quietest undoing. The bottle watched from its shelf, patient as time, catching the last flicker of the lamp before the night swallowed everything whole. Morning came slow to the docks of London, sliding through fog and the masts of ships like a ghost reluctant to wake the living. Crates were stacked to the sky, tea from Ceylon, tobacco from Virginia, cotton from India, the empire's veins pulsing with trade and dominion. Among them, almost invisible in its plain wooden packing, lay something that smelled faintly of earth and sun. A shipment from Bombay, marked for the Royal Pharmaceutical Society, cannabis indica medicinal extracts. The men unloading it barely noticed. To them, it was just another box of leaves and powders, another fragment of empire passing through their hands. But to the physicians waiting in the drawing rooms and hospital halls of London, these leaves carried something the city itself had lost the promise of quiet. By the 1840s, the empire had already conquered the tropics, but not its own nerves. Steam engines screamed across iron rails, factories burned through the night, and men spoke of progress with shaking hands. The British mind, ever restless, needed sleep, and it would find it, not in prayer or peace, but in the bottles arriving from the east. In Calcutta, British surgeons stationed with the Indian Army had begun to notice something strange. The native labourers who chewed or smoked the hemp plant seemed less troubled by pain, their wounds healing with eerie calm. Major William Brooke O'Shaughnessy, a physician of restless intellect, studied the phenomenon with fascination rather than fear. He distilled the resin, measured its effects, and wrote of its remarkable powers in allaying pain, convulsion, and spasm. He prescribed it to cholera victims, epileptics, and soldiers trembling from fever, and watched as the plant softened the edges of their agony. When his reports reached London, the scientific journals filled with cautious awe. A new sedative from the Orient, a plant of peace. Within a decade, British apothecaries began ordering tinctures of cannabis from India, mixed into alcohol or oil, bottled and labelled in Latin. They called it extractum cannabis indicae, and it spread quietly through the empire like a rumour too gentle to fear. Doctors prescribed it for childbirth pain, for neuralgia, for nervous disorders of the female kind. In the colonies, officers used it to calm soldiers before surgery, or to quiet men haunted by what they had seen. The tincture became a quiet thread in the empire's machinery, a gift from the colonized to the colonizer, stripped of its ritual and repackaged as science. No one questioned its origins. In India, cannabis had been sacred, burned in festival fires, mixed into drinks, offered to gods. In Britain, it became something else entirely, an experiment in control. Each bottle distilled not only the plant but the hierarchy of empire, the belief that even nature could be disciplined, labelled, and owned. By the 1860s, London's pharmacies glimmered with its promise. On the polished counters of Piccadilly and Westminster, elegant women bought tinctures in green glass bottles, their servants carrying the remedies home in velvet-lined baskets. The city was learning to medicate its soul, to pour calm into its veins like wine, but in the shadows of that calm was something unsaid, a tremor, a whisper of dependence. For every bottle emptied, another seemed to appear. The empire's great machine ran on caffeine by day, on laudanum by evening, and by night on the soft, slow mercy of cannabis. And somewhere, in the pages of O'Shaughnessy's notebooks, a quiet warning waited that any medicine powerful enough to silence pain might also silence something deeper, the part of the human spirit that endures it. The empire was listening, but not closely enough. The ships kept coming, the bottles kept glowing, and the silence inside them grew. In the conservatory of the Royal Botanical Gardens at Kew, the air was always warm, heavy with the perfume of faraway soil. The glass panes trembled softly with the wind, and through the misted light, rows of green leaves shimmered like jewels from every corner of the empire. Palms from Jamaica, orchids from Burma, ferns from Borneo, and in a small cordoned corner near the medicinal section, a darker, humbler plant stood beneath a hand-lettered placard, Cannabis indica. It grew quietly, unremarkable to the untrained eye. The stems were thin, the leaves narrow and pointed, arranged like slender fingers reaching toward the light. Yet the botanist who tended them, a young man named Edwin Calthorpe, knew that within those delicate veins was something that defied both science and superstition. He was the son of a clergyman, raised to see the world in clean categories of sin and salvation. But here, under glass, the old divisions fell away. The plant, he believed, belonged to neither heaven nor hell, only to nature, which answered to no one. Each morning, Edwin recorded his observations in a leather-bound notebook, specimen thriving, soil slightly alkaline, resin notable. He noted how the leaves trembled differently under sunlight than under gaslight, how the scent deepened toward evening into something almost human, warm, sweet, faintly melancholy. Visitors passing through the greenhouse rarely noticed him kneeling by the pots. They lingered on the orchids or the strange, carnivorous plants from South America, but sometimes, late in the afternoon, a physician from the city would arrive with polite interest and quiet urgency. One of them, a Dr. Reynolds, private physician to the Queen herself, asked for a cutting. "Her Majesty suffers from rheumatism," he explained, his voice measured, "and sleep has become a fragile guest." Edwin nodded, though something in him hesitated. It was one thing to study the plant, it was another to send it into royal veins. Still, he wrapped a small sample in linen, sealed it with wax, and handed it over. For science, he told himself, but in that moment, something ancient passed between them, the hush of an empire trading faith for chemistry. In those years, Victorian science was a cathedral of ambition. Every discovery carried a sermon's tone. To cure was to conquer, to master nature was to moralize it. Cannabis, strange, foreign, unchristian, was quickly dressed in the language of respectability. Journals praised its gentle efficacy. Pharmacists wrote of its civilized administration. The plant was no longer the laughter of mystics by the Ganges. It was the Queen's medicine, the scholar's experiment, the empire's achievement. And yet Edwin could never shake the feeling that it watched him. Some evenings, after the gates of Kew had closed and the gardeners gone, he would walk through the greenhouse alone, lantern in hand. The flame flickered across thousands of leaves, but it always seemed to rest longer on the hemp plants. He would pause, listening. The night insects droned, water dripped, and in the stillness he imagined the faintest whisper, not of warning, but of memory. He began to wonder if the plant remembered the hands that first cultivated it, the voices that prayed over it, the festivals and fires and songs. Here in London, under glass, it was tamed, yet, in its silence, it seemed to mourn. By spring, Edwin's notebooks were full, but his conclusions were empty. He had measured every root and resin, charted every reaction, yet the essence of the plant remained just beyond his reach. When he finally closed the journal one evening, he wrote a single line on the last page. "The leaf behaves as though it dreams." Outside, the fog rolled in from the Thames, curling around the domes of Kew like smoke. The lamps along the path flickered out one by one, until only the greenhouse remained lit, a fragile, glowing heart in the dark. Inside, the botanist's dream continued to grow, green and patient, waiting for the world to wake and remember what it had forgotten. The corridors of Buckingham Palace echoed softly with the sound of polished boots and whispers. It was the year 1871, and London was a city of progress and plague gaslight on marble, soot on lace. Within those gilded halls, where silence was a form of etiquette, pain had become a private visitor. Queen Victoria, the most powerful woman in the world, was aging, and her body, once resolute as empire, had begun to betray her. Dr. John Russell Reynolds was summoned quietly to her chambers, as he had been many times before. He carried not a vial of opium nor a syringe of morphine, but a small green bottle wrapped in silk, its label written in his own precise hand. Cannabis indica tincture, 1 drachm, administered as required. In his journal, he would later write that it was by far the most valuable of all medicines I have known. But here, in this hushed room, it was not science that mattered, it was trust. He found Her Majesty seated near the fire, her eyes distant with exhaustion. The long years of childbirth, grief, and duty had left her nerves frayed. Reynolds bowed slightly. "Your Majesty, I've brought a preparation that may help with the spasms." She regarded the bottle with a mix of curiosity and fatigue. "It smells of the East," she murmured. "Of India." "Yes, ma'am," Reynolds replied. "It is a remedy long known to them, one we have refined for gentler use." He poured a few amber drops into a spoon and stirred them into a glass of water. The Queen drank slowly, her expression unreadable. Outside, the snow was falling soft, relentless, the kind that muffles even the city's heartbeat. Within minutes, the tension in her face began to ease. The tremor in her hand grew still. "How strange," she whispered, "to feel peace arrive so quietly." Reynolds stood in silence, watching the transformation, the faint smile that returned to her lips, the slow unclenching of her fingers. He had seen the same calm spread across the faces of factory workers, wounded soldiers, and women in confinement. Cannabis did not erase pain. It softened its edges, allowing breath where once there had been only endurance. But outside these royal walls, such gentleness was beginning to trouble the moralists. Newspapers whispered of exotic sedatives and oriental indulgence. The idea that the Queen herself might rely on a plant associated with the colonies, with mystics, fakirs, and native ritual unsettled the empire's self-image. The British public wanted its power clean, mechanical, and sober. It did not want to imagine that the Queen's strength came, in part, from an Indian leaf. Still, Reynolds continued his prescriptions. He wrote with clinical precision, but also with quiet defiance, defending cannabis against its detractors. "In almost all painful maladies," he noted, "its usefulness is most remarkable." He believed that medicine was not a question of geography, but of mercy, that a good doctor must borrow wisdom wherever it bloomed. Years later, when the Queen's health declined again, she asked for the tincture herself. Her ladies-in-waiting recalled the faint scent that followed her rest resin, rose water, and something sweetly smoky. She slept well those nights, dreaming perhaps of Balmoral's quiet hills or of a younger world untouched by duty. For Reynolds, the success was both triumph and omen. He had brought relief to a monarch, but he had also brought a colonial remedy into the heart of empire. The same empire that extracted cures from conquered lands would soon condemn them as vices when their origins grew inconvenient. When he left the palace that evening, the city's lamps were just beginning to flicker through the snow. The doctor paused for a moment under the archway, gloved hands clasped around his empty case. He exhaled into the cold and watched his breath drift upward, pale, fleeting, like smoke from a faraway garden. Night in London moved like a tide, slow, heavy, and full of whispers. In a narrow townhouse on Hanover Street, a mother sat beside her child's bed. The candle burned nearly to its base. The boy had been coughing for weeks, his body thin as parchment, each breath a tremor. The doctor had already come and gone, leaving behind a brown glass bottle sealed with red wax. The label, written in delicate script, read "Tincture of Cannabis Indica, 5 drops as needed for sleep." She hesitated before uncorking it. The smell that rose from the bottle was not unpleasant, earthy and faintly sweet, like rain on dry soil. It did not carry the acrid sharpness of laudanum, nor the bitterness of morphine. Instead, it reminded her of the gardens she had walked as a girl, long before the city swallowed everything in smoke. With careful hands, she counted the drops into a spoon, mixed them with warm milk, and lifted it to her son's lips. He swallowed without protest, too tired for fear. She brushed the hair from his forehead and waited. Outside, carriages rattled over cobblestones, and the air smelled faintly of coal and fog. Within minutes, the boy's breathing steadied, his face softening into something like peace. The sound of the coughing stopped. For the first time in many nights, she allowed herself to breathe. Across the city, thousands of homes mirrored that same quiet ritual. The tincture had become a companion to the sleepless, the anxious, and the grieving. Soldiers returning from Crimea used it to calm their trembling hands. Seamstresses took it for aching joints. Writers mixed it with sherry to silence the noise of their own thoughts. The Victorians, so burdened by progress, had found in cannabis a momentary escape, a hush between the gears of the industrial age. Pharmacists called it the gentle calm. Newspapers advertised it in elegant typeface, for nerves, for pain, for the agitations of modern life. It was sold alongside peppermint tonics and cod liver oil, a quiet miracle in an age of overwork and worry. No one spoke of addiction then. The word belonged to other, darker medicines. Cannabis was mild, respectable, almost innocent. Mothers bought it without shame. Clergymen recommended it in moderation. But beneath the calm was something subtle, an unease too faint to name. Doctors began to notice that some patients asked for stronger doses, that the line between healing and habit blurred like mist. Still, few questioned the comfort it brought. Pain was a constant in the 19th century. Comfort was not. And when comfort could be poured into a teaspoon, who would refuse it? One evening, as the mother on Hanover Street watched her son sleep, she felt a strange stillness in the room. The fire had burned low, the clock had stopped ticking, and for a moment she imagined that even time itself had fallen under the tincture's spell. She realized then that the silence was not just relief, it was surrender. The medicine had not conquered pain, it had merely quieted it, the way snow muffles the sound of distant suffering. Downstairs, the bottle glowed faintly in the candlelight, half empty now, its contents reflecting the soft amber of the flame. She knew she would use it again because peace, once tasted, is hard to forget. Outside, the bells of street. Martin struck midnight, and the city, for a moment, seemed to breathe as one calm, drowsy, and unaware that the same stillness that healed would one day be feared. The boy slept, the mother watched, and the empire, vast and restless, dreamed of control, never knowing that a single drop of peace had already begun to undo it. The paper smelled faintly of dust and candle soot. It had traveled across oceans and deserts, carried by ship and rail, until it reached a modest townhouse in Bloomsbury. The envelope bore the seal of the British Medical Service in India. The ink faded by the heat. Inside was a letter written in neat, deliberate strokes, the kind of handwriting that belonged to a soldier doctor, trained to measure both words and wounds. Camp Lahore, Punjab, March 3, 1857. To the Royal College of Physicians, London. Gentlemen, I have observed, with increasing interest, the peculiar effects of the Indian hemp upon both native troops and civilians. In small doses it allays hunger and pain, soothes the nerves, and provokes laughter. In excess, it renders the mind ungovernable. I submit this not as superstition but as fact. The plant's influence upon the human spirit is unlike any in our pharmacopoeia. The letter was signed Dr. Arthur Pembroke, Assistant Surgeon, Bengal Regiment. In his tent, under a sweltering sky, Dr. Pembroke wrote by lamplight, while the camp around him hummed with insects and distant drums. The soldiers slept fitfully in the heat, their bodies sore from marches through endless dust. Fever and despair were as common as gunpowder. Cannabis, or bhang as the locals called it, had become his most reliable ally. It was cheap, plentiful, and astonishingly versatile. When mixed into tea or smoke, it eased the tremors of malaria and softened the phantom pains of amputees. He had seen men dying of dysentery sit up and smile after a single draught, whispering that they could feel the wind again. He had also seen the other side soldiers who wandered into the jungle laughing, barefoot, never to return. The line between medicine and madness was as thin as the paper he wrote on. Still, he believed it worth studying. Pain, he wrote, is the true tyranny of the tropics, and this leaf may yet teach us its undoing. Back in London, his letters were read in smoky rooms by men in waistcoats and monocles who spoke of empire and science as if they were the same thing. They praised his diligence, his bravery, his rational detachment, and ignored the parts that frightened them. They published the data, not the doubt. Soon, Indian hemp appeared in British medical journals, stripped of its local names and rituals, reborn as cannabis indica. But for the people of India, the plant was no laboratory novelty. It had been there for centuries, smoked by fakirs, brewed by farmers, offered in worship to Shiva, the god who dances between destruction and rebirth. The British, fascinated and fearful, saw in these rituals both mysticism and menace. They took the plant's body and left behind its soul. Dr. Pembroke continued his experiments for years, his reports growing more cautious as the rebellion of 1857 flared around him. He treated the wounded from both sides, his tent filled with the smell of blood and resin. "The tincture calms even the dying," he wrote, "but I begin to suspect it also remembers." When his final letter arrived in London, it contained no data, only a single sentence scrawled across the page. "The plant heals, but it also listens." No one quite knew what he meant. The Royal College filed the note away, another curiosity in the endless archive of empire. Yet somewhere in the Punjab, beneath a sun too bright for comfort, the fields of hemp still swayed in the wind, the same wind that carried Pembroke's words home. And in those quiet leaves, the empire's contradiction ripened, a conqueror's medicine born from the conquered earth, waiting for the day when gratitude would turn to fear. The room was small and dim, a narrow garret beneath the eaves of Soho, where the wallpaper had begun to peel like old parchment. A single window looked out over the rooftops, where the fog hung low and the chimneys whispered. Inside, a lamp hissed softly, burning oil down to its last inch. The poet sat at his desk, ink-stained fingers trembling, his lungs drawing in smoke that curled blue against the ceiling. He called it his Indian muse. A small brass pipe, bought from a sailor in Limehouse, still carried the scent of spice and far-off markets. The resin bubbled faintly as it burned, releasing that same faint sweetness that had filled the apothecaries of Fleet Street and the wards of Buckingham Palace. But here, in this forgotten attic, it was not medicine, it was revelation. His name was Thomas Hale, though few remembered him after his death. He had once written verses for the Times, elegies, and travel poems for polite readers. But after he discovered the tincture, and later the smoke itself, his words changed. They became stranger, softer, as if the language itself had begun to breathe. His notebooks filled with lines that wandered like dreams. The air is made of memory. The heart drifts like a lantern through fog. London's artists were beginning to gather in quiet defiance of reason. They met in dim parlours lit by candles and scandal, where the air smelled of tobacco, absinthe, and hashish. Painters, poets, philosophers they called themselves, the Club des Hashishin, borrowing the name from the Parisian salons of Baudelaire and Gautier. The empire that prized order and duty was growing restless under its own weight, and these dreamers sought escape in a world of colour and sound beyond the reach of daylight. Hale wrote that cannabis did not intoxicate him but unlocked the hinge of thought. Under its influence he swore he could hear time breathing, could feel the pulse of the city as if its gas lamps were hearts. The fog became a living thing, a spirit that spoke in rhyme. For hours he would sit in silence, pen unmoving, convinced that inspiration required stillness rather than effort. When he did write, the words came all at once, feverish and luminous. But the calm never lasted. The mornings after were grey and cruel. The same smoke that opened his mind also blurred its edges. He grew forgetful, distant, chasing visions that no longer came. Friends began to avoid him, afraid of his haunted stillness. Editors rejected his new poems as incomprehensible, though not without beauty. He pawned his watch, then his coat, and still bought more resin. One evening in 1868, He was found asleep at his desk, the lamp burned out, the pipe still warm beside his hand. The pages before him were covered in fragments, words written and crossed out, as though he had tried to describe the unnameable. Among them, one sentence remained clear: "The plant does not lie, it only shows what we already feared to see." The newspapers called it a sad case of moral decline. His friends buried him quietly, without sermon. Yet his words, found later in a small volume titled Dreams from the East, whispered of something the empire could not forget, that beneath its precision and pride, it longed for surrender. And so the poets and painters kept smoking, even as the doctors frowned and the priests condemned. They sought not intoxication, but escape from machinery, from manners, from the endless ticking of progress. In their smoke, London dissolved into something fluid, unmeasured, alive. The world called them decadent. They called themselves awake. The city outside their windows marched on factories, sermons, empire. But in one dim attic after another, the pipes glowed softly, and the poets dreamed of a gentler England, one that breathed, and wept, and wondered. By the time the year 1893 arrived, the empire had grown uneasy with its own appetite. What began as a quiet fascination with the healing leaf had become a matter of scandal, whispered through government halls and missionary reports. In London, parliamentarians spoke of native vices and moral contagion. In Calcutta, missionaries lamented the sight of coolies laughing in the streets, claiming that the hemp plant was turning men into beasts. The British, in their usual way, decided that the problem required a committee, and so the Indian Hemp Drugs Commission was born, a grand inquiry meant to settle the question of cannabis once and for all. 7 commissioners, 57 witnesses, and more than 1,000 pages of testimony. It was, in truth, less an investigation than an exorcism. They came from across the empire: colonial officers, medical men, priests, and magistrates, each with their own creed to defend. The hearings were held in rooms so hot that even the ink seemed to sweat. Ceiling fans spun lazily above them as translators whispered in both directions, English to Hindi, Hindi to English, trying to bridge the distance between law and life. The first witnesses were farmers from Bengal, dark-skinned men in coarse linen, who stood barefoot before the empire's representatives. They spoke plainly. Hemp was their livelihood, their medicine, their inheritance. It was woven into their festivals, brewed in their cups, smoked at dawn before the fields. "It keeps the sun away," one man said softly. "It makes work light." The commissioners scribbled their notes without looking up. Then came the doctors, British, polished, confident. They described the plant as both blessing and burden. "In moderate doses," said one, "it is as safe as tea. In excess, it may unhinge the weak-minded." The room murmured. Another doctor rose, a missionary's son, and declared that it was a poison to the soul. He spoke of delirium, of madness, of moral decay among natives who surrendered their will to smoke. His words hung heavy, not because they were true, but because they were familiar. The empire had always feared pleasure in the hands of the conquered. For months, the hearings went on. Soldiers testified that hemp made their marches bearable. Prison guards admitted that inmates grew calmer when allowed a pipe. An Indian physician, his voice steady, argued that the British misunderstood the plant entirely. "You fear what you cannot control," he said, "but this medicine has healed our people since before your queen was born." The stenographer paused, perhaps unsure whether to include such defiance in the record. When the final report was published in London, it surprised everyone. After a year of testimony, the commission concluded that cannabis was not the evil it was accused of being. "Its moderate use," they wrote, "is practically attended by no evil results whatever." The by-leaf, it seemed, had been vindicated by reason. Yet in that victory lay the seed of its downfall. The report did not silence the missionaries or the moral reformers. They took its findings as proof that the empire's moral fiber was eroding. To them, the true danger was not the plant, but what it represented a crack in the illusion of British purity. The government filed the report away, satisfied to leave the matter under observation. But the whispers did not stop. Years later, one of the commissioners would admit privately that they had all sensed the deeper truth. The debate had never been about medicine, but about control. The empire could tolerate pain. It could not tolerate freedom. And so, beneath the same sun that had warmed the fields for centuries, the farmers kept planting, the soldiers kept smoking, and the empire kept pretending not to notice. For a brief moment, the leaf had spoken and been heard, and then the world, as always, turned its face away. By the 1870s, London's heartbeat had grown mechanical. Trains thundered through tunnels like veins of iron, and the air itself trembled with invention. Telegraphs hummed, typewriters clattered. The city's new century was being built from noise and nerves. Men who had once spoken of destiny now spoke of deadlines. Sleep came fitfully, if at all. And so, as civilization quickened, so too did its craving for calm. The chemists noticed first. Sales of extractum cannabis indica began to rise not only among the sick but among the sane, or at least the exhausted. Barristers, bankers, and clerks came to the counter after dark, their eyes dull from gaslight, their fingers stained with ink. They no longer asked for laudanum, which had become the drug of widows and invalids. They wanted something softer, cleaner, without the stigma of sin. Just a few drops, they would say, sliding coins across the marble counter. Something to steady the mind. And so the plant that had crossed oceans and empires became the silent lubricant of London's progress. It drifted through drawing rooms and counting houses, passed quietly between gloved hands and teacups. The advertisements called it the modern restorative, a phrase that seemed to promise both ease and ambition. For sleeplessness, neuralgia, hysteria, and the fatigue of the intellect. The Victorians did not yet have the word stress, but they were already drowning in it. At the London hospital, Dr. Howard Baines began keeping a record of his patients' ailments, not their physical wounds, but the new invisible ones: trembling, exhaustion, despair without cause. He called it civilization sickness. His prescription was simple: cannabis tincture, administered nightly, 5 to 10 drops in warm water. The results astonished him. The patient reports a distinct loosening of the mind, he wrote, as though the machinery of thought were oiled. The phrase would later be reprinted in medical journals across the empire. It was said that poets wrote more gently, engineers slept longer, and even bishops confessed to feeling closer to grace. The plant that once belonged to Indian peasants now soothed the empire's most respectable citizens. For a brief, shimmering moment, it seemed that progress itself had found its antidote, a cure for the very anxiety it had created. But not everyone trusted the calm. Social reformers began to murmur that comfort breeds complacency. The Englishman's virtue, they argued, lies in his discomfort, his unrest, his striving. Newspapers published editorials warning that too much ease might soften the national character. Missionaries returning from India claimed that hemp had undone entire villages, turning industrious farmers into dreamers. If it weakens them, one wrote, it may weaken us. Still, the bottles sold faster than ever. Even Queen Victoria's quiet use had become an open secret, whispered about, but never condemned. At soirees and salons, the fashionable would joke, half in irony, half in confession, that civilization itself now ran on cannabis by night and caffeine by day. Dr. Baines, whose ledger filled with stories of serenity, grew uneasy. He began to notice that his patients returned sooner each time, their doses creeping higher, their calm more fragile. It is not dependence, he told himself, but adaptation. Yet one evening, he caught sight of his own reflection in the darkened glass of his surgery, the same grey exhaustion, the same hollow calm. That night, he opened one of his own bottles, poured a few drops into a cup, and watched the liquid ripple in the lamplight. "A cure for civilization," he whispered, and drank. The bitterness surprised him. It was the taste of both comfort and surrender, the empire distilled into a single, shining drop. Outside, the machinery of London rolled on, vast and unstoppable. Inside, the doctor slept, at last not knowing that his small act of mercy was also the beginning of forgetting. In the back room of Whittaker and Sons Apothecary on Fleet Street, the dust never truly settled. Ledgers lined the shelves in perfect rows thick, bound in cracked leather, their pages yellowed by candle smoke and the touch of countless hands. Each entry was a small confession. Names, dates, ailments, doses. The handwriting never wavered, though the lives it recorded often did. Mrs. Langford, insomnia, 5 drops tincture of cannabis. Captain Avery, neuralgia, repeat dosage approved. Mr. Crane, melancholia, 8 drops nightly. The apothecary himself, Mr. Elias Whittaker, was a man of precision. He believed that medicine was not mystery but arithmetic, that pain could be measured, balanced, and tamed by the right combination of numbers and drops. Yet even he sometimes paused as he wrote, the quill trembling slightly between his fingers. Lately, the same names kept returning, the ink deepening over time like a shadow that refused to fade. It was evening, and the shop was closing. Outside, the street buzzed faintly with carriages and the scent of rain. Inside, only the steady tick of the wall clock broke the silence. Whittaker tallied his day's sales by lamplight, as he did every night: opium, ether, quinine, and, increasingly, the small green bottles labeled Extractum Cannabis Indicae. Once an exotic rarity, they now sold faster than he could import them. Clerks ordered by the dozen. Army officers requested them in bulk for regimental use. Mothers came with prescriptions for their children, their voices soft with guilt. He turned a page and noticed something odd. The ink smudged from his own thumb, a dark streak across the column of dosages. He reached for a cloth, then stopped. The smudge reminded him of blood. He closed the book and sat back, staring at the shelves of bottles that glimmered like a quiet choir under the lamplight. "You heal them," he whispered, "and yet they never stop returning." It was not addiction. Not exactly. Cannabis did not demand the soul the way morphine did, but it whispered instead of ease, of stillness, of forgetting. The patients wanted that more than cure. They wanted the hush. Whittaker began to see it in their eyes, the same dazed calm that lingered too long, the same faint smile of those who had found relief and lost something unnamed in the exchange. One afternoon, a letter arrived bearing the seal of the Royal Pharmaceutical Society. It warned of irregularities in the import and labeling of cannabis extracts, advising that the potency must be reduced to ensure consistency and prevent excess. Whittaker read it twice and folded it carefully. He had always trusted measurement, but how did one measure a human threshold? That night, he stayed late in the back room, ledger open before him. He began a new page, but found he could not write. Instead, he dipped his quill once more and wrote only a single line across the margin. "We are learning to cure what makes us human." Then he closed the book. He poured himself a drop from the same tincture his customers adored, more out of curiosity than need. The taste was faintly bitter, with an aftertaste of iron and sweetness, the empire's strange alchemy of mercy and control. As the minutes passed, the edges of the room softened, and the world seemed to quiet itself into surrender. When the lamp finally burned out, the apothecary's shop was still, the ledgers stacked neatly, the air heavy with the scent of resin and ink. Outside, London's rain fell steady and indifferent. Inside, the bottles gleamed faintly in the dark, their contents untouched by doubt, waiting, patient, immortal. The ledger on the counter remained open to that final line, the ink not yet dry. The hospital smelled of damp linen, coal smoke, and the faint metallic tang of disinfectant. Gas lamps burned low along the corridor, their light muffled through glass that had yellowed with age and soot. It was nearly midnight, and the night ward was quiet except for the low hum of breathing, the uneasy rhythm of bodies caught between pain and rest. Dr. Samuel Faircroft moved softly between the rows of iron beds, notebook in hand. He had come to study sleep, not the act itself, but the way medicine could manufacture it. His patients were soldiers, factory workers, and fevered clerks whose minds had been trained too long to stay awake. They arrived pale, trembling, sleepless for days. The age of steam had given men the power to work without pause. It had also robbed them of the mercy of exhaustion. For months, Faircroft had been experimenting with cannabis tincture, a mild solution, 10 drops diluted in water. He had charted the effects with the same precision a mathematician might apply to numbers. Patient 47, asleep in 12 minutes, pulse steady, respiration normal. He took pride in the regularity of his results. The tincture was less dangerous than chloral, gentler than morphine, more reliable than prayer. Tonight, however, something unsettled him. As he passed from bed to bed, noting the rise and fall of chests under the blankets, he felt a strange stillness in the air, not peace, but absence. The patients slept too deeply. Their faces had the soft, waxen calm of statues. A nurse crossed the room, her slippers whispering against the floor. "Doctor," she murmured. "They dream." He looked up. "Dream?" She nodded. "They speak sometimes. Names, places, the same words again and again." She hesitated. "They sound lost." Faircroft followed her gaze to one of the older men, a soldier whose arm had been lost in Afghanistan. The man's lips moved faintly as he slept, whispering what might have been a prayer or a warning. The doctor leaned closer. "The river," the man murmured. "The river burns." His eyelids fluttered, then stilled again. In his notes that night, Faircroft recorded the observation, but avoided the word fear. He called it instead somnolent agitation. Yet something in the way the ward breathed, the synchronized hush of bodies subdued by the tincture, began to haunt him. He realized that he was no longer curing insomnia. He was manufacturing surrender. When dawn came, the patients awoke in the same moment, as if guided by some invisible bell. They were calm, polite, grateful. "I haven't dreamt so well in years," one man said. But Faircroft could not forget the soldier's words. He began lowering the doses, searching for a balance between peace and oblivion. Weeks later, he wrote a paper for the Lancet titled "On the Hypnagogic Properties of Cannabis Indica." It praised the drug's gentle efficacy in restoring nervous equilibrium, and his peers applauded. But in the margins of his own copy, he scribbled something he never published. "Perhaps it is not true sleep we offer them, but silence mistaken for mercy." That night, long after the hospital had gone still again, he poured himself a small glass of the tincture, not for science, but for solitude. The bitterness of the medicine lingered on his tongue. He lay back and waited for sleep to come, wondering whether the dreams that followed would be his own, or borrowed from those who had slept under his watch. By morning, the bottle on his desk had tipped over, staining the papers beneath. The dark green liquid spread across his notes like ink, erasing the words until only the blankness remained clean, quiet, and complete. The science of sleep, he thought later, was not about dreams at all. It was about forgetting. The lecture hall smelled faintly of chalk and damp wool. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows like a living thing, dulling the gaslight until even the professors' faces looked half erased. Dr. Henry Wallace stood before his students at the University of Edinburgh, his hands clasped behind his back, his voice calm but measured. On the blackboard behind him, a single phrase had been written in careful script: cannabis, indica, and the colonial psyche. He was not a physician by trade, but a scholar of philosophy and psychology, a new discipline, fragile and strange, that sought to chart the invisible workings of thought. To him, The plant was not merely a medicine, but a mirror, a reflection of the empire's own divided soul. "Gentlemen," he began, "when a civilization consumes something it does not understand, it reveals more about itself than about the thing consumed." The students shifted uneasily. Some took notes. Others stared at the faint tendrils of vapor rising from the gas lamps, half listening. "In India," Wallace continued, "the hemp plant was a bridge between work and worship, between pain and peace. Here, it has become a wall. We have taken the sacred and called it chemical." He paused, letting the words settle like dust. "And in doing so, we have learned not about India, but about England." At the back of the room, a young man raised his hand. "Do you mean, sir," he asked, "that the drug changes the mind, or that it reveals it?" Wallace smiled faintly. "Both, perhaps, for an empire that governs by reason cannot tolerate what it cannot quantify. We believe the mind to be a machine, and yet we seek to mend it with mystery." He turned back to the board and began sketching a diagram, 2 circles overlapping, body and empire. "When we dose ourselves with the fruits of conquest, gentlemen, we bring the colony inside the bloodstream." There was laughter, polite but nervous. Yet Wallace meant it. He had seen it firsthand during his years in India. Officers who used cannabis to calm their nerves before battle then condemned the same plant as the cause of native indolence. He had watched Englishmen grow philosophical under its influence, speaking of God and eternity, only to wake ashamed and angry at their own softness. They feared the loss of control, he told his students quietly. And control, you see, is the only God an empire truly worships. His lectures soon drew both admiration and suspicion. Medical journals quoted his theories. Church leaders denounced them. The Times called him a man of unsettling intellect. He received letters from soldiers, writers, and even doctors who confessed that his words had touched something true, that they too had felt the empire living inside them, whispering through the tincture. But the university grew uncomfortable. His language was too poetic, his metaphors too dangerous. One morning, he found an unsigned notice slipped under his door, requesting his resignation in the interest of moral clarity. He did not protest. Instead, he packed his notes, sealed his lectures in a trunk, and left Edinburgh for London, where he disappeared quietly into obscurity. Years later, when his manuscripts were found among his effects, scholars discovered one final essay, unpublished and unfinished. In it, Wallace had written, "The empire sought to conquer the world, but in doing so it discovered a greater empire, the empire of the mind, and the first colony lost was reason itself." No one knows whether he wrote those words in anger or under the slow calm of the tincture he studied so well. But in the quiet of that London flat, surrounded by his books and bottles, Dr. Henry Wallace became the empire's truest chronicler, not of its wars, but of its dreams. The lamps in the Kensington townhouse glowed like captured suns, their warm halos softening the edges of everything, the mahogany furniture, the lace curtains, even the women themselves. It was Thursday, which meant visitors, and Mrs. Beatrice Linton's drawing room, filled with polite laughter and the rustle of silk. Beneath the fragrance of perfume and roses, however, lingered another scent, faint but unmistakable, sweet, resinous, and foreign. The maid had prepared the evening's refreshments according to her mistress's quiet instructions, a tray of fine china teacups, each already stirred with a few drops from a small green bottle. Beatrice called it her nerve elixir, but its proper label, tucked discreetly away in the apothecary cabinet, read tincture of cannabis indica. It had begun as necessity. After her husband's death, Beatrice had fallen into what her doctor called hysterical melancholia, the fashionable term for grief that refused to behave. She could not sleep. Her hands trembled at breakfast. Her heart fluttered without cause. Laudanum made her sick, and morphine dulled her completely. But one evening, Her physician, young, modern, and quietly daring, had suggested a new remedy from India. "It will not erase the sadness," he said gently, "but it will make it bearable." That night, she had slept, not dreamlessly, but deeply, as though the weight of the world had shifted just enough for her to breathe again. The next morning, she awoke clear-headed and calm, and by afternoon, she was writing letters, humming softly to herself. Her friends noticed. Soon, they began to visit. By 1880, what had started as mourning became a ritual. The women gathered weekly to talk, to drink, to forget the long afternoons of loneliness their station demanded. They spoke of children and husbands, of poetry, of travel subjects safely contained within the boundaries of decorum. But as the evenings grew late and the tea turned warmer, their conversations loosened. Words spilled more easily. Laughter came from the chest instead of the throat. Someone would play the piano, and someone else would tell a secret she would never have uttered sober. "It brings back the feeling of being alive," said Mrs. Greaves, a widow of 40 who had once been a governess. "As if we're not just ghosts in corsets," the others murmured in agreement. They did not call it indulgence, but restoration. The tincture allowed them to exist outside the script written for them without hysteria, without guilt. But word of these gatherings began to spread. One of the husbands, uneasy about his wife's newfound calm, mentioned it at his club. "They drink the stuff from India," he muttered, "like it's tea," laughing to themselves in the night. Soon, the gossip reached the ears of clergymen and columnists. The Illustrated London News published a story titled "The Follies of Female Intemperance," warning of foreign medicines that lead gentlewomen into moral slumber. Beatrice read the article and said nothing. That evening, she drew the curtains before lighting the lamps and poured the tincture more slowly, her hands steady, her face serene. The laughter in the room that night was quieter, but not dimmed. Outside, carriages rattled over wet cobblestones. Inside, the air shimmered with the faint sweetness of rebellion disguised as refinement. Years later, when she was old and her hands had grown frail, the bottle remained on her nightstand. The doctor had long since retired, the friends had scattered or died, but sometimes, in the soft hours before dawn, Beatrice would pour herself a single drop and wait for the gentle calm to return. She no longer needed it to sleep, she took it to remember, for in that small green bottle, hidden behind the trappings of civility, she had found something no law or sermon could name: a brief, golden reprieve from the empire of expectation. And in the hush that followed, she dared to believe that peace, for women like her, was not sin but survival. The lamps in St. Bartholomew's Hospital burned late into the night, their thin light trembling across tiled walls that had seen too much blood. In the operating theatre, the air was sharp with ether, carbolic acid, and fear. Surgery in the year 1879 was still a performance of endurance, a race between precision and agony. There were no machines to assist, no steady hum of anesthesia to soften the moment when the knife met flesh. There was only the surgeon's hand and the trembling of his own humanity. Dr. Lionel Harcourt had performed hundreds of amputations since his return from the Sudan campaign. His hands were steady, his reputation immaculate. They called him the Clockwork Man, a surgeon who never faltered. Yet, what no one saw, beneath his practiced calm, was the quiet tremor that began each evening as he washed his tools. His right hand, the one that guided the scalpel, would twitch as though it remembered the screams he tried to forget. One night, while he prepared for another operation, a miner crushed beneath a collapsed beam. His assistant noticed the shaking. "Your hand, sir," the young man whispered. Harcourt glanced down, mortified, and reached for the drawer where he kept a small green bottle brought back from Calcutta. He uncorked it with care and poured a few drops onto his tongue. Within moments, the tremor slowed, then stilled. The familiar warmth spread through his chest, quiet and sure. The tincture of cannabis indica, he had discovered it years before, when army surgeons stationed in India swore by it to calm the nerves of both patients and practitioners. "The leaf steadies the hand," they said. In the sweltering tents of the desert, where men lost limbs faster than they lost faith, it had been a mercy. Now, back in London, Harcourt had brought that mercy home. As he stepped into the theatre, the students watched from the upper gallery, their faces pale behind the glass. The patient was already bound and half-conscious, the ether mask trembling with each breath. Harcourt's movements were flawless, swift, decisive, almost mechanical. The room was silent but for the sound of the saw and the soft rhythm of his breath. When the last suture was tied, he stepped back, his pulse steady, his expression calm. "There," he said quietly, "it is done." Afterward, in his office, he stared at his hands. They did not shake. Yet the calm that followed was heavier than relief. It was emptiness. The tincture, once taken for steadiness, had begun to feel like surrender. He needed it before every surgery now, not because his hands would fail, but because his heart might. In the months that followed, younger surgeons began to follow his example. They spoke of cannabis as a surgeon's blessing, a tool for endurance in a profession built on horror. The newspapers called them men of iron nerve, never knowing that their courage came bottled and corked. But there were nights when Harcourt stayed long after the lamps burned low, listening to the quiet drip of water through the pipes, feeling the weight of the day settle in his bones. He kept one bottle on his desk, another in his coat pocket. Sometimes he wondered if he still guided the scalpel, or if the medicine guided him. On the night he retired, his assistant found him alone in the theatre, staring at the empty chair where the patients sat. The bottle beside him was nearly drained. "You can cure pain," Harcourt murmured, "but you cannot cure the memory of it." The assistant took the bottle away, but it didn't matter. The hand no longer trembled, not because the nerves were healed, but because they were finally, completely numb. The surgeon's gift had become his penance. A calm so deep, it silenced even the part of him that once cared to shake. In the heart of Calcutta, where the air shimmered with incense and dust, a temple bell rang at dawn. The sound rolled through narrow streets where cows wandered past shrines draped in marigolds, and men in saffron robes stirred clay pots of bhang, a drink of milk, almonds, and crushed cannabis leaves prepared for the festival of Shivaratri. Smoke rose like prayer from 1,000 rooftops. To the people of India, the hemp plant was not medicine or vice, it was blessing. On that same morning, only a few streets away, a British missionary named Reverend Arthur Langley opened the shutters of his mission school and grimaced at the scent that drifted through the window. He had arrived from Bristol 3 years earlier, determined to save souls and civilize minds. What he found instead was a people who worshipped with joy, sang with abandon, and drank something he could not understand. To him, the green leaf was sin made visible. "They speak to their God through smoke," he wrote in a saying, letter home, "and call it devotion." Yet among his pupils was a young Bengali boy named Rajen, quiet, quick to learn, who lingered after lessons to ask questions about heaven and mercy. One day, as the Reverend was leaving the chapel, he found Rajen sitting cross-legged near the gate, grinding hemp leaves with a mortar and pestle. "Does this not trouble you?" Langley asked sharply. The boy smiled. "It brings me close to the stillness inside," he said, "the same stillness you find when you pray." The missionary hesitated. He wanted to argue, to correct, but something in the boy's serenity disarmed him. That night, he wrote in his journal, "They worship through the same means by which we heal." The line between sacrament and sin grows thin beneath this sun. While Britain praised cannabis as medicine, its clergy condemned its spiritual roots. Missionaries across the empire campaigned against what they called the idolatrous intoxication of hemp. Pamphlets described Indian rituals as debauchery disguised as prayer. "It loosens discipline," one bishop warned, "and tempts the soul toward darkness." To the empire, order was divine, ecstasy was rebellion. But the Indian priests who prepared the bhang each morning believed differently. They spoke of the plant as Shiva's gift, a means to quiet the ego, to dissolve the boundaries between body and spirit. To them, the British obsession with control seemed its own kind of madness. One old sadhu told a colonial officer, "You drink your wine to forget yourselves. We drink this to remember." In London's drawing rooms, few understood this contradiction, that the same empire which denounced the sacred leaf abroad was bottling it at home as medicine. Science stripped the plant of its spirit and gave it Latin names. Faith, in turn, stripped it of science and called it vice. The two halves of empire, reason and religion, pulled against each other, each claiming virtue, each blind to its twin. Years later, when Reverend Langley returned to England, he brought with him a small brass bowl, the kind used in temple offerings. He kept it on his desk, though he never spoke of it. Sometimes, when the night grew long and his sermons felt hollow, he would touch its rim and remember the scent of smoke and milk, the sound of distant bells, and the boy's quiet words about stillness. He never drank bhang, not once, but he began to wonder whether the empire's mission had been less about saving souls and more about silencing them. "Perhaps," he wrote in the margin of his final sermon, "we feared the flower because it reminded us how fragile our faith truly is." When he died, the brass bowl passed to his daughter, who mistook it for decoration. It sat on a mantel in Surrey for decades, empty, gleaming faintly in the afternoon light, a relic of two worlds that once met in smoke and prayer, and never fully understood each other. The asylum at Bethlehem, known to Londoners simply as Bedlam, crouched like a fortress of silence behind its iron gates. Morning mist clung to the high walls, blurring the crosses on their peaks, and the faint moan of wind through the barred windows carried something that was almost a voice. Inside, rows of narrow beds stretched through the wards, each occupied by a body that trembled, muttered, or stared into a void only they could see. The empire's new obsession, the human mind, was being dissected here, cell by cell, under the guise of care. Dr. Andrew Willoughby moved among his patients with the caution of a man who feared his own curiosity. He had once been a fashionable physician, a lecturer at Guy's Hospital, praised for his writings on nervous maladies. But his fascination with the brain's shadows, those unseen illnesses of thought and soul, had drawn him here, to this place where the line between science and cruelty had worn thin. He believed, as many did in the 1880s, that madness might one day be cured by chemistry. In his pocket, he carried a small vial of dark amber fluid, Extractum Cannabis Indicae. The label had faded, but the promise remained. He had begun administering it months before to a select few patients, those whom the asylum had failed with every other method. It was, he believed, the perfect experiment, a substance that quieted the body without the violence of opium or restraint. "It softens the storm," he wrote in his log. "It makes the mad remember gentleness." Among his patients was a woman named Clara Evers, 32 years old, formerly a pianist, committed after prolonged melancholy and auditory hallucinations. She seldom spoke, except to hum fragments of sonatas no one recognized. When the tincture touched her lips, she would close her eyes and breathe as though she were somewhere else, somewhere with windows open to the sea. For hours afterward, she would sit perfectly still, her hands poised as if over invisible keys. "Do you hear it?" she once asked him, her voice barely a whisper. "The music isn't gone, it's just slowed." Dr. Willoughby recorded her progress carefully. Sleep restored, tremors reduced, no signs of aggression. For a time, he felt the thrill of salvation, the belief that perhaps madness could be quieted, not crushed. But the more he observed, the more he sensed an unease within that calm. The patients did not seem cured. They seemed paused. Their eyes lost focus. Their words became distant, as if they stood just behind a veil of smoke that he himself had drawn. Rumors spread among the staff. "The doctor gives them the Indian drug," a nurse whispered. "They sit there smiling, as if their souls have been borrowed. The asylum superintendent, a stern man of the old school, called him to account. "We treat the mind," he snapped, "not its reflection in narcotics. These patients must wake, not dream." Willoughby defended his work, citing journals and case studies, but the order came nonetheless. Cease all administration of hemp preparations immediately. The following week, Clara relapsed. Her fits returned, worse than before, her voice breaking against the walls like a trapped bird. The doctor watched helplessly as the attendants bound her wrists once more. That night he wrote a single sentence in his logbook before tearing out the page. "Perhaps we have mistaken silence for healing." When the asylum bell rang for dawn, Willoughby stood by the barred window of his office, the vial of tincture held between his fingers. The liquid caught the light like a green flame. He uncorked it and hesitated not for himself, but for the sound of that vanished piano, the melody that had once floated through these halls. Then he poured it into the sink. The scent lingered, sweet and sorrowful, until morning. Years later, the asylum burned. Only fragments of his notes survived, a handful of pages stained with resin and ink. One of them read, in his uneven hand, "The mind does not always need saving. Sometimes it only needs to be heard." And beneath that, scrawled faintly, almost invisible, "She played again, if only for a moment." They found the little book decades later, tucked behind a drawer in a mahogany writing desk at a boarding house in Manchester. The paper had yellowed to the color of candlelight, and the ink had faded to a brown so soft it was nearly gone. Inside, on the first page, written in an elegant but fragile hand, were the words, "The Diary of Eleanor Marsh, begun April 12th, 1876, for the sake of remembering what pain cannot erase." Eleanor had been a seamstress before illness found her. Her spine had twisted after a long winter of fever, and the ache never left. Doctors prescribed rest, broth, and faith. When neither prayer nor poultices helped, she was sent to St. Mary's Infirmary, where she was treated by Dr. Samuel Faircroft, the same man who had once written of the science of sleep. It was he who placed in her hands a small bottle of tincture from India, explaining with professional calm, "This may give you back your nights." Her first diary entry, after, that reads like a sigh made visible. April 15. "I took 5 drops at dusk. There was a bitter taste, but afterward a sweetness in the air I cannot name. The pain loosened its claws, and for a few blessed hours I felt as though I were floating in water. I dreamed of sewing a wedding gown under a summer sky, and I awoke with tears on my face, though I do not know why." Over the weeks, her handwriting grew steadier. The tincture dulled her suffering but sharpened her senses in other ways. She wrote of hearing music from the next room that no one else could hear, of colors that seemed to breathe, and of time that moved differently when she closed her eyes. "The world becomes gentle," she wrote, as if God himself had taken a deep breath. But then the pages began to shift. May 2, "I am well enough to stitch again, though the world feels slower now. I do not speak much. The girls in the workshop say I am distant, but they do not understand how loud everything once was, before this silence." May 20, "I dream often now. In the dreams, I walk without pain, but when I wake, my hands tremble as if they have been sewing for years. Sometimes I forget entire afternoons. Mrs. Linton says this medicine is a miracle. I wonder what kind of miracle makes you forget your own laughter." The final entry was dated June 3, 1876. The handwriting was faint, the ink shaky. "It no longer hurts, but neither does it feel. I wonder if peace is only another word for distance. Still, I take the drops, because I fear what I might remember without them." After that, the pages were blank. The bottle was later found empty on her bedside table, the cork still beside it like a witness. When the diary surfaced nearly a century later, historians quoted its passages in journals about Victorian medicine and addiction. But in truth, the pages read less like a case study and more like a prayer, the voice of a woman caught between two kinds of mercy, the kind that heals, and the kind that forgets. No one ever learned what became of Eleanor Marsh. Perhaps she recovered and left the boarding house behind. Perhaps not. But her words endured the quiet confession of an ordinary woman who had learned what the Empire's doctors refused to see, that pain and peace, like ink and water, cannot always be separated once they touch. The river moved like old glass beneath the fog, its surface broken only by the slow churn of barges and the pale reflections of lamps flickering through the haze. Along the south bank, where warehouses leaned over the water like tired giants, men huddled beside the stone embankment, their pipes glowing faintly in the dark. The air smelled of coal smoke, brine, and something sweeter, faint, earthy, almost floral. It was not tobacco, it was hemp. By the 1880s, London's underworld had found its own use for the Empire's medicines. What began in apothecaries and parlours had drifted downriver into the alleys, lodging houses, and taverns of the poor. Cannabis was no longer the tonic of queens or doctors, but the refuge of night labourers, sailors, and street musicians who needed a little warmth when the fog pressed too close. They called it Indian smoke, and it passed quietly from hand to hand, unmeasured, untaxed, unblessed. Among them was a man known only as Jonah, a lighterman by trade, who ferried cargo between ships and shore. His days were spent among ropes and shouts, his nights beneath the arches of Blackfriars Bridge, staring at the river's dim pulse. He carried in his coat a small pouch of resin he had bought from a sailor newly returned from Calcutta. When the work was done and the pubs were closing, Jonah would sit by the river's edge, crumble a pinch into his pipe, and light it with a match cupped against the wind. The smoke softened the world, the ache in his shoulders eased, the clamour in his skull slowed. The river, once a place of toil, became almost tender. The lights of Westminster shimmered like faraway stars, and for a moment he could imagine himself somewhere else, somewhere warm, where the air did not taste of soot. Sometimes others joined him, dock workers, costermongers, the occasional soldier on leave. They would share the pipe and sit in companionable silence, the way only those who have nothing left to prove can sit. One man claimed it kept him from gin, another said it cured his nightmares. They did not call it medicine, though perhaps it was. They called it rest. But above them, the city did not rest. The newspapers had begun to print strange stories, oriental fumes in London's slums, warning of foreign habits creeping into English blood. The same empire that had trafficked the plant by the ton now recoiled from its shadow. Police raids followed, brief and mostly theatrical. The men laughed about it afterward, certain that no one would care enough to truly stop them. But the laughter never reached the eyes. They all knew the pattern, how pleasure, once discovered by the poor, was swiftly rebranded as vice. One night, a constable found Jonah's pipe on the riverbank beside his coat and boots. The tide had gone out, leaving the stones slick with frost. No body was ever recovered. In his pouch were 3 coins, a bit of rope, and a half-ounce of resin wrapped in linen. When dawn broke, the city resumed its ordinary rhythm, smoke rising from chimneys, bells tolling, engines starting. But down by the Thames, the fog held its breath a little longer. For a brief hour, the scent of the night's smoke still lingered above the water, a ghostly perfume of earth and fire, as if the river itself had taken a drag and was reluctant to exhale. By afternoon, the wind shifted, and the last trace of it was gone. Only the water remained, dark and patient, carrying the Empire's secrets out to sea. The brass bell above the pharmacy door rang sharply, and Mr. Edmund Rycroft looked up from his counter with a start. It was a wet November afternoon, and the grey light outside made everything inside the shop seem sepia and old. Shelves lined with green and amber bottles glowed dimly in the gaslight, each bearing the delicate calligraphy of cures: tinctura op, laudanum, chloral hydrate, and, at the far end, a small section reserved for the plant that had made his fortune and haunted his conscience, cannabis indica. The customer was a woman in a modest coat, her gloved hands clasping a folded prescription. Her eyes were polite but tired, the sort of exhaustion that came not from labor but from worry. "For my husband," she said softly. "The doctor recommends it for his nerves." Rycroft nodded, took the paper, and turned toward the back shelves. He reached for a familiar bottle, its glass cool and faintly oily to the touch, and poured a measured drachm into a smaller vial. He had done this hundreds of times before, yet lately each transaction seemed to weigh more. The newspaper on his counter still lay open to a headline from the morning edition: "The New Vice of the Middle Class: Indian Drugs in English Homes." The article spoke of dependency, of moral decay disguised as prescription. It was, Rycroft thought grimly, written by a man who had never known pain. He handed the bottle to the woman with the usual caution: 5 drops in water at night. No more. She thanked him, her voice barely above the whisper of the rain against the windows, and left. The bell jingled again, then silence. Rycroft exhaled and leaned against the counter. His father had founded this shop in 1832, when medicine still smelled of superstition and salt. He had grown up among mortars, pestles, and the belief that nature itself was a cathedral of healing. But the world had changed. Every year the empire brought back new discoveries: barks, resins, powders, all promising miracles. And every year another miracle soured into menace. He still remembered the first bottle of cannabis tincture that had arrived from Bombay in its straw-lined crate. The label shimmered faintly in gold, as if blessed. It had been marketed as the safest sedative known to science. Doctors praised its versatility. Even the Royal College had approved it for inclusion in the British Pharmacopoeia. For a time, it truly seemed the world had found a harmless peace. But peace, he had learned, was never harmless. Patients returned week after week, not in pain but in longing. They wanted the silence it brought, the way the world softened after the drops touched the tongue. "It's only a medicine," they said, yet he could see the tremor in their hands when the bottle was half empty. That night, long after he closed the shop, Rycroft sat by the fire with his ledger open. The ink reflected the flames like water. He traced his finger down the columns of names, numbers, and dates. Each one represented a life briefly quieted but not cured. He could still hear his father's old warning: the measure of a pharmacist is not what he sells, but what he withholds. He rose, crossed the room, and removed every bottle of cannabis from the shelf. He set them on the counter, their labels gleaming faintly in the lamplight. Then, one by one, he unstoppered them and poured the tincture down the sink. The smell filled the room, sweet, resinous, like crushed leaves after rain. When it was done, the bottles stood empty, their glass glinting clean and hollow. Rycroft wiped his hands on his apron and looked at the waste swirling away into the drain. He could not name the emotion that filled him: relief, perhaps, or guilt's quieter cousin. Outside, the rain quickened, washing the city's cobblestones, and through the fogged window he thought he saw the faint reflection of the river itself, carrying everything away: medicines, secrets, and sins alike. Rain traced crooked paths down the windows of Guy's Hospital, blurring the city beyond into streaks of grey and gold. In his office, Dr. Charles Ambrose sat surrounded by books and silence, his spectacles fogged, his tea long cold. The desk before him was cluttered with the usual instruments of his trade: stethoscope, ledger, microscope, but it was the small green bottle at the center of it all that held his gaze. Extractum cannabis indicae. He had prescribed it for others hundreds of times, but tonight, for the first time, he hesitated to use it himself. He had written about the drug's virtues once, in the hopeful tone of a younger man. A safe anodyne, he had called it, soothing to body and spirit alike. The journals had praised his confidence, reprinted his findings, cited him as authority, but now, years later, his certainty had eroded, worn thin by observation. Too many of his patients returned unchanged, their faces calm but empty, their eyes dull as if the quiet portion of the soul had been anesthetized along with the pain. He opened the ledger to his most recent case: Miss Lydia March, age 26, chronic melancholia. improved under tincture. Increasing dependency noted. Beneath it, a second note written in his smaller, more private hand. She no longer speaks of recovery, only of quiet. Ambrose leaned back in his chair, the old wood creaking beneath him. Through the wall, he could hear the faint sounds of the ward nurses moving softly, a man coughing, someone murmuring in delirium. The hospital was full of pain, and pain demanded answers. Yet the answers, he thought, were beginning to sound like excuses. He uncorked the bottle, just slightly. The smell rose at once, sweet, dusty, almost warm, like memory itself. He poured a single drop onto a square of gauze and studied it under the lamp. The color fascinated him, that deep amber hue somewhere between medicine and honey. Something so beautiful, he thought, should not be so deceitful. He remembered a patient from years before, a poet, young and dying of consumption, whose final request had been to dream without coughing. The tincture had given him that wish. For 3 nights he slept peacefully, smiling faintly as if hearing a distant melody. On the 4th, he stopped breathing altogether. Ambrose had written the death as natural causes, but the truth had never left him. The drug's mercy, he suspected, could be too complete. He closed the bottle and stared into the lamplight until his vision blurred. "We call it healing," he whispered, "because we cannot bear to call it surrender." A knock at the door startled him. A young intern entered, hat in hand. "Doctor, another prescription from the South Ward. Patient requests the Indian extract. Says only yours helps." Ambrose took the slip of paper, its ink still damp, and for a moment he couldn't bring himself to sign it. His pen hovered above the line, trembling. The boy watched in silence. Finally, Ambrose wrote his name slowly, deliberately, and handed it back. When the intern left, the doctor extinguished the lamp. The office fell into shadow, save for the faint glow from the rain-slicked window. Outside, London breathed its endless breath of smoke and steam. Inside, Ambrose sat unmoving, the scent of cannabis lingering like confession. He wondered, not for the first time, whether he had spent his career curing pain or merely teaching it to whisper. At last, he stood and placed the green bottle in the cabinet beside the rest: morphine, chloroform, ether, each one a miracle, each one a trap. Then he locked the door and slipped the key into his pocket, though he knew it made no difference. What the world called progress, he thought, was simply the refining of mercy until it looked like control. And somewhere down the corridor, another patient slept, dreaming gently, dreaming far, under a doctor's signature that smelled faintly of India and regret. The monsoon had passed, leaving behind a city drenched in heat and dust. In the government offices of Calcutta, papers curled in the humidity, and ink bled faintly through their edges. Outside, the streets pulsed with colour vendors calling out, oxen plodding through mud, the scent of spice and rain rising from the ground. But inside, under the high ceilings and slowly turning fans, the British administrators sat behind mahogany desks, surrounded by ledgers, reports, and contradictions. Major Edward Tilney, Director of Colonial Health for Bengal, removed his spectacles and rubbed his eyes. Before him lay 2 documents that, together, defied reason. One was a report from the Indian Hemp Commission, declaring cannabis harmless in moderate use, a plant of ancient heritage, beneficial to the health and happiness of the natives. The other was a dispatch from London, bearing the seal of the Home Office, warning of the moral degradation caused by Indian hemp, a vice unbecoming of the empire's subjects. Both were official, both bore authority, and both could not be true. Tilney sighed and turned to his clerk, a young Bengali man named Hari Sen, whose calm efficiency often concealed a sharp wit. "How," the major asked, "am I to reconcile these?" He gestured to the papers. "One claims the drug is a blessing, the other, a scourge." Hari smiled faintly. "Sahib, perhaps it depends on who is smoking it." The words lingered longer than they should have. Tilney chuckled awkwardly, but the truth stung. In the officers' clubs of Simla and Bombay, cannabis tincture was a mark of sophistication, the empire's latest scientific wonder. Yet, in the bazaars, the same plant was condemned as barbaric, its users labeled indolent and unfit for progress. One law for the colonizers, another for the colonized. That evening, as the city dimmed into the orange of kerosene light, Tilney left the compound and walked along the Hooghly River. The air was thick with jasmine and smoke. On the steps by the water, he saw laborers resting after the day's work, passing a clay pipe between them, laughing softly. They seemed at peace, not idle, not corrupted, simply alive. For a moment, he envied them their ease. Then a missionary's carriage clattered past behind him. The priest inside glaring from under his hat, muttering about native wickedness. The image shattered. Tilney straightened his coat and walked on. That night, unable to sleep, he opened the drawer of his desk and took out his own bottle of cannabis tincture, prescribed to him after a bout of malaria. He uncorked it, hesitated, and poured a few drops into a glass of water. The taste was bitter and strange, a mingling of medicine and guilt. Soon the weight in his chest lifted, replaced by an almost holy calm. The noise of the city softened until it sounded like breathing. He thought of the men by the river and the priest's glare, of London's decrees and India's laughter. He imagined the empire as a vast body, one half dosing itself in secret, while the other half was punished for doing the same. It was not a contradiction, he realized. It was design. The empire did not fear intoxication. It feared equality. When morning came, Tilney wrote a memorandum that no one would read. It ended with a single line that his clerk, Hari, would later copy into his own notebook before resigning in quiet protest. We have brought our medicine to the colonies, and in doing so, learned that it was never medicine at all, but permission, and we never meant to share it. By noon, Tilney's report was filed, stamped, and forgotten, buried beneath other papers declaring progress, order, and peace. But outside, along the riverbanks, the smoke still rose, patient, fragrant, and free, drifting toward the same indifferent sky that watched over both the ruled and the rulers, each lost in their own illusion of control. The inquest was brief, though the whispers that followed it were not. A woman found dead in her rooms in Paddington, a widow of 42, respectable, pious, and known to suffer from sleeplessness. Her name was Mrs. Ada Morton, and on her nightstand the constables found a small bottle with a torn label, cannabis indica, tincture 5 drops as needed. There was no note, no signs of struggle, and no evidence of violence. Only the faintest smile upon her lips, a calm so unnatural it chilled the coroner himself. The newspapers seized upon the story at once. "Death by Eastern drug," cried the Illustrated Police News, its front page adorned with a sketch of the widow's peaceful corpse and the caption, "The green poison of India invades the English home." Preachers railed from pulpits about the corruption of the body and soul. "It begins," one thundered, "with a drop for comfort, and ends with eternal sleep." But the doctors knew the truth was not so simple. Dr. Lionel Harcourt, once known as the clockwork surgeon, had been called to testify. He examined the bottle and shook his head. "The dose could not have killed her," he said. "It must have been something else, heart failure, exhaustion, grief." But the magistrate, eager for clarity, pressed on. "Then you deny the danger of this substance?" Harcourt hesitated. In the gallery, the reporters leaned forward. He remembered the smell of the operating room, the steady pulse of his own trembling hand, and the warmth of the tincture that had steadied it. He remembered how quickly that same warmth had turned cold. "I do not deny," he said slowly, "that it brings comfort, but I will not swear it brings safety." The verdict read, "Death by misadventure." Yet among the public, a darker story took root, that Mrs. Morton had died, not from illness, but from temptation. "She smiled in her sin," wrote one clergyman in the Times, "as Eve smiled before she fell. For a clout, while, London's pharmacies felt the tremor. Mothers hesitated at the counter. Gentlemen glanced nervously at their prescriptions. But fear has a short half-life in a city built on exhaustion. Within weeks, the trade resumed. The dead woman's name faded to rumor, and the demand for calm returned. In the quiet of his home, Dr. Harcourt kept a clipping of the article folded in his medical journal. He would read it some nights before bed, the words already ghosted by the passage of his thumb. He thought often of Ada Morton, of the fine lace collar she had worn, of the faint smile that had unsettled the coroner. Perhaps it was not poison at all, he sometimes told himself. Perhaps it was release. But another thought lingered, darker, that the plant he had once praised as mercy had begun to mock its makers, that in a world obsessed with progress, death itself had learned to imitate serenity. A month later, the newspapers printed another story, this one about a soldier found dead in his barracks, a bottle of cannabis tincture beside his cot. He too was smiling. The editor placed the two clippings side by side beneath a single headline, "The Gentle Poison of Empire." When Harcourt saw it, he closed the paper and set it aside. The room smelled faintly of alcohol and rain. He went to the window and looked out at the blurred lights of London. The city was alive, yes, but it was sleeping, too, under a haze of gaslight and smoke. Somewhere, he thought, 1,000 bottles gleamed on nightstands just like hers, promising peace in measured drops. And somewhere in that peace, the Empire was learning a dangerous lesson that death, if delivered softly enough, could look like grace. It was a grey February afternoon in 1891 when the House of Commons gathered under its great vaulted ceiling to decide the moral fate of a plant most of them had never seen. Outside, the Thames glistened like pewter beneath the drizzle. Inside, the air was thick with rhetoric and cigar smoke. The benches creaked as members shuffled papers, adjusted waistcoats, and cleared their throats for battle. What began as a discussion on the regulation of medicines had, somehow, turned into a trial of Empire's conscience. The Right Honourable Thomas Ellery, member for Kent, rose first. His moustache bristled with indignation. "Gentlemen," he began, "it has come to our attention that the so-called Indian hemp, that heathen weed of the Orient, is being dispensed in our very homes, to our wives and daughters, as if it were no more dangerous than tea. I say to you, it is a menace, a foreign seduction masquerading as cure." Murmurs of approval rippled through the chamber. Ellery tapped his stack of papers dramatically. "Here, gentlemen, are reports from our own colonial officers describing madness, debauchery, and idleness in the East. Is that what we wish to import to London?" Across the aisle, Sir Jonathan Brigg, physician and member for Manchester, stood slowly, his voice even but weary. "With respect," he said, "those same colonial officers also send reports of its virtues, of its ability to relieve pain where opium fails, to calm tremors where morphine destroys. Will you ban a remedy because it offends your imagination?" He paused, scanning the faces before him, lawyers, industrialists, men who had never known illness beyond gout. "If this medicine were made in Birmingham rather than Bengal," he added quietly, "would you still call it dangerous?" The chamber erupted in protest. "Unpatriotic nonsense," cried one. "Comparing English science to native sorcery," shouted another. The speaker's gavel struck 3 times before the noise subsided. In the gallery above, the press scribbled furiously. Their headlines were already half-written. "Foreign drug threatens English morality." They knew that fear sold faster than nuance. Ellery regained the floor, his voice swelling like a sermon. "We are not merely legislators, gentlemen, we are custodians of civilization. Shall the empire that abolished the opium dens of the East now invite the same degradation upon itself?" He gestured toward the benches, finger trembling with righteous fury. "We must protect the English spirit, industrious, sober, and unseduced by the perfumes of pagan vice." When the debate adjourned for supper, the corridors buzzed with contradiction. Some MPs whispered that the plant was harmless, others that it was the devil's own smoke. In the dining hall, the same men who had denounced the drug drank brandy until their cheeks glowed red. Later that night, Sir Jonathan returned to his study overlooking the river. He poured himself a glass of water and added 3 careful drops from a small bottle. The amber liquid caught the lamplight like a secret. As the warmth spread through his veins, he felt neither guilt nor pride, only exhaustion. He thought of the men in the chamber, their booming voices, their fear of anything they could not tax, their certainty that control was virtue. Outside, Big Ben struck 10, its chime echoing across the damp city. In the silence that followed, Sir Jonathan murmured, "We speak of saving England, yet we cannot even admit what soothes her." The next morning's paper carried the headline he had expected: Parliament to consider ban on Indian hemp morality before medicine. The resolution would not pass that year, nor the next, but the motion had been planted, like a seed in cold soil, waiting for its season, and when it finally bloomed, it would not grow in the gardens of science, but in the shadows of fear, watered by speeches, headlines, and the quiet hypocrisy of men who condemned by day what they consumed by night. By the turn of the century, London had become the beating heart of an empire that spanned oceans, languages, and faiths, and yet, for all its outward pride, the city pulsed with quiet unease. The docks teemed with faces the newspapers called strange: Indian sailors, Chinese traders, Egyptian porters, men who smelled of spices and smoke, who carried stories the British did not wish to understand, and wherever they gathered, the same scent seemed to follow them: sweet, heavy, unmistakable. Cannabis. It drifted through limehouse alleys and lodging-house corridors, curling like incense through windows left ajar. To those who lived there, it was comfort, the one soft thing in a city made of iron. But to those who wrote the laws and printed the headlines, it was something else entirely: evidence. Alien habits, declared the London Herald in its January 90-on-2 issue, beneath a crude drawing of a turbaned man offering a pipe to a pale English woman. The empire's poison returns to the motherland. The story, exaggerated from a single police report, spoke of foreign dens where sailors and women of low virtue succumbed to Eastern seductions. No one mentioned that most of those arrested were simply men trying to sleep off the weight of the docks. The article's closing line was the one that lingered: "The smoke of empire, if not contained, will choke its maker." Inspector Alastair Griggs, head of the Metropolitan Police's new Moral Health Unit, clipped the story and pinned it to his wall. He was a man of rigid jaw and simple faith, who believed deeply in the idea of England, an England untainted by what he called foreign contagions. Under his supervision, raids became weekly rituals. They kicked in doors along Cable Street and Shadwell, dragged bewildered men from their beds, seized pipes and bottles, and led them through the streets as examples. One night, his patrol descended on a small tea house run by an Indian ex-soldier named Iqbal Singh. Inside, a few sailors sat in silence, passing a clay chillum between them, the smoke rising like prayer. There was no gambling, no women, no noise, only the slow rhythm of breath. Griggs stormed in, shouting, overturning tables, demanding to know what wickedness was being practiced. Singh, calm as still water, replied, "Only remembrance, sir. You took our land. We keep the memory." That answer unsettled the inspector more than any defiance could have. He arrested them all. The next day, the papers called it a den of Eastern vice dismantled. Griggs was promoted. Yet the raids changed nothing. The smoke always returned. Each arrest fed the fear it claimed to fight. The language hardened: heathen leaf, black menace, colonial narcotic. The empire had begun to turn against its own reflection. The same plant it had once exported as medicine was now the symbol of its anxiety, proof that its children abroad were creeping back to haunt it. Meanwhile, in the grand drawing rooms of Mayfair, gentlemen still sipped their cannabis tonics beneath the portraits of explorers and queens. Their bottles came from the same importers as the chillums seized in the docks. The only difference was the label and the skin of the hand that held it. By 1905, the Home Office had begun drafting its first serious proposals for a ban. But the true law had already been written not on paper, but in fear. The English imagination, once so hungry for the exotic, now recoiled from it. In the dark along the Thames, the last chillum of the night was lit by a match cupped against the wind. The smoke rose quietly toward the city's sleeping towers, toward the same windows where men dreamed of empire, and then vanished, as all ghosts do, into the air that created them. In the spring of 1890, a thin, unassuming volume arrived on the desks of Britain's physicians. Bound in sober grey and embossed in gold, it bore a title that few outside the medical profession would ever notice: the British Pharmacopoeia, Revised Edition. Inside, in columns of small type and careful Latin, was a quiet erasure that signalled the beginning of an ending. The dosage for extractum cannabis indicae had been reduced, not stricken, not condemned, but diminished. The change occupied barely half a line, but in that space, an entire century of curiosity began to close its eyes. No preface explained it. No clerk at the Royal College of Physicians would admit to its reasoning. Officially, the plant had become unreliable in composition, too variable, too inconsistent for modern science. Unofficially, the Empire had grown uneasy with the comfort it had once praised. Dr. Henry Ambrose, now an old man, grey-haired and stooped from decades of tending to other people's suffering, received his copy on a wet afternoon in May. He read the line 3 times before setting the book down beside the fire. For years, he had suspected this moment would come. The whispers had been growing louder, that cannabis was un-English, that it bred idleness, that it belonged to a vanishing age of superstition. Progress, it seemed, required purification. He remembered when the first edition had declared it a marvel, the gift of Indian science to the Empire's medicine. He had written papers, delivered lectures, and filled prescriptions for soldiers, mothers, and poets alike. He had called it a bridge between mercy and knowledge. Now the bridge was being dismantled brick by brick, replaced by the sterility of laboratories and the clean hunger for control. Ambrose poured himself a cup of tea and watched the rain run in rivulets down the window pane. The world outside was speeding up, trams clanging, factories smoking, the great machine of progress turning without pause. The new medicine reflected the new man, efficient, predictable, measurable. There was no room left for mystery. Still, he kept a single bottle of the tincture in his study, its label browned with age, the cork stained by time. Sometimes, when the pain in his hands grew unbearable, he would take a few drops. It no longer brought the same relief, or perhaps he had simply outgrown the kind of peace it offered. But the scent of it, earthy and strange, reminded him of the Empire's brief flirtation with humility, when doctors had still believed that healing might come from listening rather than conquering. Across London, in the apothecaries and hospitals, the same quiet revision unfolded. Clerks replaced old stock with new, crossing out the former dosages in their ledgers. Some grumbled that the new tinctures were weaker. Others shrugged and said it was safer that way. Few understood that they were participating in a small act of forgetting. The revised pharmacopoeia would soon make its way through the colonies too, carried in leather cases by British doctors bound for Africa, Burma, and the Caribbean. Wherever it went, the margins grew narrower, the measurements stricter. The plant that had once travelled the world as healer was now being disciplined, tamed into near extinction by ink and bureaucracy. That evening, Ambrose returned to his chair and opened the book again. The new entry looked clean, clinical, complete. Yet, as he read it, he thought he could almost hear the faint rustle of the fields in India, the sound of hands grinding leaves into powder, the whisper of a culture the Empire had borrowed from but never thanked. He closed the pharmacopoeia and stared into the dying fire. Science, he thought, had not defeated superstition. It had only learned to speak it in Latin, and on that rain-washed night, while London hurried toward its bright and sleepless future, A chapter in medicine ended quietly with a single, edited line, and the silence of a doctor who finally understood that progress could forget as easily as it healed. It arrived on Dr. Henry Ambrose's desk one autumn morning in 1894, its envelope marked with a red seal from across the Atlantic. The letter was written on thick, cream-colored paper, and the handwriting, elegant yet hurried, belonged to a man Ambrose had never met. The signature read, Dr. William Halstead, Johns Hopkins Hospital, Baltimore, Maryland. Ambrose adjusted his spectacles, curious. America, he knew, was the empire's unruly child, young, loud, convinced it could outgrow its parents' mistakes while imitating them at every turn. The letter began politely, as all professional correspondence did, but beneath its careful tone pulsed something urgent, almost desperate. Dear Dr. Ambrose, I have studied your writings on the uses of cannabis indica in the management of pain and nervous exhaustion. You will be interested, I think, to learn that our own physicians in the States have followed similar paths and are now retracing them with equal alarm. Halstead's penmanship slanted harder here, as though the ink itself trembled. Our pharmacies once sold the tincture freely. Housewives kept it in the kitchen beside laudanum. Poets praised it. Soldiers swore by it. Yet now the public has turned. They speak of madness, of colored men, and foreign sailors seducing white women under its influence. Newspapers cry reefer madnesses and oriental degeneracy. The plant that soothed has been condemned as threat. The irony, of course, is that we learned its virtues from you and inherited your fear alongside your science. Ambrose set the letter down, staring at the rain streaking the glass. He could almost hear the Atlantic between the lines, roaring with the same hypocrisy that had carried British ships to India. The letter continued, detailing new American laws, tariffs, restrictions, whispers of prohibition. Doctors hesitated to prescribe it now. Pharmacists locked their remaining bottles behind the counter. It is as if, Halstead wrote, the moralists have mistaken calm for corruption. He confessed that even his own hospital board debated removing cannabis from its list of approved sedatives. We fear not the drug, but what the newspapers will call us if we use it. It was the empire's shadow, all over again, cast now upon another continent. At the letter's end, Halstead posed a question that seemed to hang in the room long after Ambrose had finished reading. How quickly must mercy become sin when the wrong man discovers it? That evening, Ambrose drafted a reply. His handwriting had grown frail, the strokes uneven, but his words were clear. My dear Dr. Halstead, I fear the world has mistaken medicine for morality. The drug is neither angel nor devil. It is merely a mirror, and what frightens them is not the plant, but the face it shows. In India, it was prayer. In England, it was peace. In America, it is panic. The fault is not in the leaf, but in the eyes that see it. He paused, looking at his own trembling hand. Outside, the city's lights flickered to life, reflections of progress glittering against the river's dark skin. Use it kindly, if you can, he wrote at last. And when they forbid it, remember what it once was, the empire's gentlest lie. He sealed the envelope and sent it off the next morning, knowing that it would reach Baltimore too late to matter. Across the sea, America had already begun its campaign of erasure, replacing understanding with fear, compassion with law. Years later, when Halstead's letter was found among Ambrose's papers, historians would call it the hinge, the moment one empire handed its dread to another. The ink had browned, the paper brittle, but one line remained legible, underlined twice in Ambrose's fading hand. It is never the medicine they fear, but the freedom it allows. The morning fog hung low over Birmingham, thick enough to swallow sound. The clock on Street Martins struck 7 as the police wagons rolled quietly through the narrow streets toward Water Street, where Dr. Elias Finch's dispensary stood. From the outside, it was an ordinary place, a narrow brick building with peeling paint and a brass plaque that read, Finch and Daughters, Apothecaries, since 1831. Inside, behind shelves of liniments and powders, lay a locked cabinet that had earned the attention of the Home Office. Inspector Raymond Clive led the raid, a career officer with a face carved from duty. He had been given orders to seize and confiscate all preparations of Indian hemp, tinctures, or otherwise, kept in violation of new import standards. The command had come wrapped in rhetoric about purity and public health, but Clive understood what it really meant. The government wanted a spectacle proof that it could still draw moral lines in an age of blurring certainties. When he entered the dispensary, the scent of camphor and alcohol filled the air. Behind the counter stood Dr. Finch himself, a thin man in a worn waistcoat, his white hair wild as smoke. He didn't look surprised. "You're a bit early, Inspector," he said, his voice calm. "I haven't even opened the shutters yet." Clive produced the warrant and laid it on the counter. "By order of the Home Office, sir, you are to surrender all Indian preparations presently in your possession." Finch's eyes flicked toward the locked cabinet. "You mean the cannabis?" "I mean whatever the government forbids." The doctor sighed, reached beneath the counter, and produced a ring of keys. The cabinet creaked open, revealing dozens of bottles lined like soldiers, green glass, white labels, all marked Extractum Cannabis Indicae. "You'll find the records in the ledger," he said. "Each sale documented, each dose prescribed under license. I have broken no law." Clive nodded to his men, who began boxing the bottles. The sound of clinking glass filled the room. A few customers, drawn by curiosity, peered through the window. One of them, an elderly woman with a shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, tapped on the glass. "He cured my son's tremors," she called out, but no one answered. When the crates were sealed, Clive turned back to the doctor. "You may submit an appeal to the magistrate." Finch's mouth twisted into a sad smile. "And say what, Inspector? That London has lost its nerve? That what once healed is now heresy?" He gestured to the shelves behind him. "You've taken half my practice in those boxes. Shall I prescribe prayer next?" Clive hesitated, the first hesitation of his career, then looked away. "I only enforce the order," he muttered. The raid lasted less than an hour. By noon, the crates were on a train to London, labeled Evidence. That evening, the newspapers carried the story beneath a headline chosen for outrage. "Den of Eastern Drugs Closed in Birmingham, Foreign Poison Seized." In the public imagination, the doctor became a villain, a trafficker of sin disguised as healer. But among his patients, the truth lingered differently. They spoke of the man who listened, who refused to judge, who gave them back sleep when the world offered none. A week later, Inspector Clive returned alone to the dispensary to collect the final paperwork. The shop was dark, the shutters nailed shut. On the door hung a note written in a steady, deliberate hand. "I opened my doors to heal, not to hide. When the law begins to fear comfort, medicine has ended, and morality has begun. E.F." He folded the note into his pocket before anyone could see. That night, sitting in his study, Clive poured himself a glass of brandy and read it again under the lamplight. Outside, the fog pressed against the window like breath. For the first time in years, he felt uncertain of which side of the law he stood on. He reached for the decanter, hesitated, and whispered aloud the word that had haunted him since morning comfort. The next day, he ordered the note burned. But long after the ashes cooled, its scent, faint, herbal, and defiant, clung to his hands. It began quietly, without decree or scandal, not with a ban, but a silence. In the years after the Birmingham raid, the word cannabis began to vanish from the prescriptions of England. One by one, doctors stopped writing it. Not because they were forbidden, but because they no longer dared. The plant had grown politically radioactive, a relic of colonial embarrassment and medical uncertainty, too foreign for the new century's appetite for precision. By 1900, Dr. Charles Ambrose's name had disappeared from medical journals. The last paper he ever published, a cautious defense of Extractum Cannabis Indicae, had been ignored by his peers, quietly omitted from citations. The age of laboratory medicine had dawned, and the gentlemen of science were determined to distance themselves from anything that smelled of superstition or the East. Standardization. They called it a word as clean as bleach. The messy, fragrant mysteries of nature no longer suited their pride. In the grand pharmacies of London, the change was almost invisible. The old bottles simply failed to return to the shelves. When a patient came asking for the tincture that once cured their nerves, the chemist would sigh and shake his head. Out of stock, he'd say, and suggest a modern alternative chloral hydrate, bromide of potassium, or morphine, if the case was dire. Most took what they were offered. Only a few protested, those who remembered how the cannabis had soothed without stealing the mind. It was gentle, they said, but gentleness no longer impressed the age of progress. In his small practice on Dean Street, Ambrose still kept one bottle hidden in his desk drawer. Its cork was dry, the liquid thick as resin now, but he could not bring himself to throw it away. Every few months, an old patient, a woman widowed by time, or a veteran whose hands still trembled would slip quietly into his office. "The drops," they whispered, embarrassed. "You remember?" And he did. Always, he did. He would pour them what little remained, carefully diluted, and send them away with the same words he'd used for decades. Take only when needed. He knew it was foolish. He knew he risked censure if discovered, but he also knew what it meant to wake in the night and find the world too loud to bear. One evening, a younger colleague visited him, Dr. Edmund Pierce, full of optimism and laboratory jargon. "Over tea," he remarked casually. "They've decided to strike cannabis from the new pharmacopoeia entirely. Too inconsistent, they say. Too foreign." He smiled, proud of the modernity in his voice. "It's progress, don't you think?" Ambrose stared at the steam curling from his cup. "Progress," he repeated softly, "is often just the name we give to forgetting." The younger man laughed, uncertainly. After he left, Ambrose opened his drawer and held the bottle to the light. The once amber tincture had darkened to white, the color of old honey. He remembered the first time he'd seen it glow under a lamplight in Fleet Street, decades ago, when medicine still believed it could heal without harm. He uncorked it, breathed the faint, earthy sweetness, and for a moment the years folded in on themselves, the soldiers, the mothers, the poets, all those he had helped to sleep. Then he recorked it, wrapped it in linen, and placed it back inside. The next morning, when the maid came to dust the shelves, she found the drawer empty. In his final years, Ambrose rarely spoke of medicine. His students said he grew quiet, detached, as though listening for something the rest of them could not hear. When he died in 1904, his papers were sorted, his instruments sold, his notes filed and forgotten. But decades later, when an archivist cataloguing his effects opened an unmarked box, she found that same small bottle, half full and still faintly fragrant. The label had peeled away, leaving only a ghostly outline of letters. Bisind. She lifted it to her nose and smiled, though she could not say why. For the plant had outlived the prescription, and the silence meant to erase it. By the first years of the new century, London had shed its gaslit gentility and clothed itself in iron. The hum of engines had replaced the murmur of prayer. The old apothecaries had become laboratories, with tiled walls and glass syringes gleaming like daggers. The new god of medicine was precision, and its prophet was the needle. Morphine, once a battlefield miracle, had become the civilized man's salvation. Doctors spoke of it with near religious awe, a pure alkaloid, measurable to the grain, obedient to calculation. There were no more tinctures or guesses, no lingering sense of resin or ritual. Pain could now be conquered by mathematics. The age of morphine had arrived, and with it, a terrible calm. At St. Thomas's Hospital, Dr. Edmund Pierce, the same young physician who had once spoken proudly of progress to the aging Dr. Ambrose, now lectured to rows of students beneath the bright glare of electric lamps. On the blackboard behind him, chalk dust spelled out the future, opioid derivatives, Reliable, rapid, refined. The words glowed white against the dark slate, the way gospel once glowed in stained glass. He spoke of dosage, of molecular bonds, of reproducibility, the new holy trinity of medicine. The problem with cannabis, he told his students, was not its danger, but its chaos. Its chemistry refused to kneel. Morphine is clean, orderly. It does not dream. The students nodded, eager to belong to the new faith. They had no patience for the past, for the soft, uncertain mercy of tinctures and teas. In the polished laboratories, pain became data, and compassion, an equation. But Pierce, though he preached certainty, was not untouched by doubt. In his private office, he kept a small locked box of personal cases. Veterans who could not sleep, women hollowed by grief, factory men whose hands still twitched long after the machines stopped. He treated them all with the same clear solution, a few measured drops of morphine, injected beneath the skin. The relief was immediate, miraculous. The gratitude, almost worshipful. But within weeks, many returned pale and trembling, their bodies aching not from pain, but from absence. "Only a small dose, doctor," they begged, "just to steady the nerves." He recorded their names carefully in his ledger, the handwriting growing tighter with each entry. Dependence noted, dose increased, restlessness observed, and always, at the bottom of the page, one word: continue. At night, when the halls of the hospital were silent except for the echo of boots and the drip of water through pipes, Pierce sometimes imagined he could hear the ghosts of medicine past whispering in the dark, the clink of glass bottles, the rustle of paper labels, the faint scent of something floral and forgiving. Cannabis had never offered such obedience, but it had never demanded such surrender either. One evening, he injected himself only a trace, for curiosity. The effect was smooth, instantaneous, heavenly. He felt the tension dissolve from his body, the fatigue drain from his mind. For the first time in years, he slept without dreams. But in the morning, the silence felt heavier than rest. He realized, with a kind of awe, that morphine did not bring peace. It replaced the need for it. A week later, during his next lecture, he paused mid-sentence, his chalk hovering above the board. "Gentlemen," he said softly, "we have not conquered pain. We have merely refined it." The students looked up, puzzled, waiting for the correction that never came. When he died some years later, they found the small locked box in his desk. Inside were dozens of empty vials, a few faded patient notes, and one object that did not belong, a small glass bottle, green and dust-covered, its cork sealed tight. The label was almost erased, but faint traces of ink remained. Extractum cannabis indicae. No one knew why he had kept it, perhaps as a relic, perhaps as confession. In the new century, medicine marched forward without it, fueled by morphine's certainty and the illusion of control. The age of dreams had ended, the age of measurement had begun. But sometimes, in the long wards where the patients slept unnaturally still, the nurses swore they caught a faint, sweet scent rising from the air, something older, something lost, as if the ghosts of the old medicine still lingered, unwilling to leave the empire it once soothed. In the back gardens of Cambridge and Kew, the glass houses, once filled with plants from every corner of the empire, had begun to close, one by one. Palms, ferns, orchids, all had their place in the great halls of science, and in a quiet corner, once cordoned off and labelled Cannabis indica, the leaves had grown tall and pale beneath the filtered sunlight. By the turn of the century, these plants were being removed, roots lifted from soil, pots scrubbed clean, as if the empire wished to erase the memory of what had once thrived there. Dr. Edwin Calthorpe, now aged and frail, walked through the last remaining greenhouse at Kew. The air smelled faintly of damp earth, but the soft perfume of hemp was gone. In its place were roses, carefully arranged, their blooms precise, controlled, respectable. He remembered the first time he had tended the Indian hemp plants, Decades earlier, the thrill of discovery, the quiet excitement of watching their veins pulse with sunlight. Here had been the bridge between empire and nature, science and miracle. Now it was gone, replaced by order. He paused before the empty corner and imagined the plant still there, tall, patient, swaying gently as though aware of the empire watching. They had been harvested not for medicine or study, but for fear. The empire had decided that cannabis, once exotic and fascinating, was too unpredictable, too dangerous for polite society. Its tinctures had been replaced by morphine, bromides, and chloral hydrate, precise, measurable, obedient. Where once the plant had healed without leaving scars, its successors demanded devotion, calculation, and surrender. The students who visited Kew no longer asked about hemp. They were curious about orchids from Burma, palms from Jamaica, plants that obeyed climate and water. The mystery of the leaf that could calm soldiers, mothers, and poets alike was considered anecdotal, a story of empire rather than science. Calthorpe often wondered whether their textbooks would ever mention it again, or if it would vanish entirely from memory, like a dream too vivid to recall upon waking. Outside, the city of London pulsed with the same relentless energy that had frightened the leaf into obscurity. Factories choked the air with smoke, trams rattled over the cobblestones, and the docks groaned under the weight of global trade. Cannabis, which had once travelled these oceans as medicine, now existed only in whispers and old bottles gathering dust in apothecaries and private homes. The empire had learned to fear what it could not quantify, and in doing so, it had taught the plant to vanish quietly, a casualty not of its effect, but of perception. Calthorpe walked slowly to the glass doors, stopping to press a hand to the cool pane. In his mind, he could still see the young botanists kneeling over their pots, recording growth, resin, and reaction. He could still see soldiers' hands steady beneath the amber drops, mothers' hands folded around warm teacups, poets inhaling the gentle smoke and finding inspiration. All of it had been stripped from the gardens, removed with the precision of a ruler and the cruelty of certainty. He turned away, the echo of the glass houses behind him empty but resonant. In a corner of the greenhouse, an old pot, cracked and forgotten, held the faint imprint of roots long dead. Calthorpe knelt and touched it lightly, feeling the memory of growth that had once been. The empire had conquered land, sea, and mind, but in the stillness of that lost corner, the plant lingered patient, unbowed, waiting for the world to remember what it had lost. The doors closed behind him with a soft click. Outside, the sun fell through fog over the city. Somewhere, a faint scent of resin carried on the wind, faint, fleeting, a ghost of what had been. The greenhouses were empty, but the memory remained. Decades had passed since the British Empire first sent cannabis across oceans in bottles and crates, labelled for soldiers, mothers, and doctors alike. The plant had travelled with the fleets, crossing the Indian Ocean, the Atlantic, and the rivers of Africa, reaching ports and colonies where the empire's authority was absolute. But empires are not silent forever, and what was exported often finds its way back, like a whisper returning to its source. In the early years of the 20th century, returning soldiers brought stories of the plant with them, whispers of calm in the jungles of Burma, of dreams softened on the plains of the Punjab. They spoke cautiously of tinctures and pipes, of evenings where the world softened and the relentless rhythm of duty and expectation fell away. Many kept it hidden in trunks or pockets, not daring to mention it in polite society. Yet, even in quiet, the memory of its mercy persisted, carried home in the scent of resin and memory. Lieutenant Charles Whitaker returned to London in 1903, his uniform pressed, medals pinned, but his hands shaking despite appearances. He had spent months on the front lines in India, treating men afflicted with fever, fatigue, and the unseen wounds of battle. He had watched young soldiers tremble with grief and fear, only to find relief in small amber bottles of tincture, and he had taken some himself, more than once, when the night pressed too close. Now, back in England, He placed a small jar of cannabis extract in the top drawer of his study, under the ledger and letters from his regiment. He would use it sparingly, for insomnia, he told himself, but he did not lie. It was the last thing keeping the edges of the world from cutting too deep. The city itself was unaware of these quiet returns. London moved as it always had, smothered in fog, soot, and the hum of industry. Yet in the lodgings of returning officers, in the rooms of families who had received letters from the colonies, the plant reappeared like a ghost. It was no longer celebrated in journals or prescribed openly in apothecaries. Its path had become clandestine, threaded through whispers, handshakes, and half-hidden cupboards. The empire that had once exported it as medicine now condemned it as vice, yet still, the plant returned, loyal to the men who had learned to trust it. The paradox did not go unnoticed by those who watched carefully. Dr. William Halstead, now an aging physician at Johns Hopkins, wrote in his journal, "The plant that crossed oceans, as healer now returns as memory. It reminds the empire of what it has forgotten. Mercy is not a law, and comfort is not a crime." Across the Atlantic, letters arrived in London describing the quiet consumption of tinctures, pipes, and teas, the same remedies once praised and now feared. In private homes, the returning soldiers administered small doses to those they cared for, wives, sisters, fathers whose sleep had been broken by grief. The act was measured, reverent, a tribute to the lessons learned in distant lands, and in that quiet, the plant reclaimed its agency, slipping past law and morality, offering relief to those who remembered its touch. By nightfall, London was wrapped in mist, and the Thames glistened like molten lead. Somewhere, a faint scent of resin drifted through a narrow street, curling past a doorway where a soldier slept, a widow stirred, a poet dreamed. The empire had returned the plant to itself, not as a gift or a threat, but as a reminder that even the strictest order cannot erase the memory of mercy. And in that memory, the world grew a little softer, a little quieter, beneath the patient, enduring shadow of green leaves carried home from afar. It was a rainy afternoon in London when Miss Eleanor Hawthorne first opened the heavy oak doors of the Royal College of Physicians archive. The scent of old paper, ink, and dust filled the room like incense. She had come to catalogue medical texts, journals, and reports from across the empire, expecting the usual monotony of prescriptions and case studies. What she found, however, was a whisper, faint, lingering, and strangely fragrant. In a high shelf, behind a row of dusty pharmacopoeias, she discovered a small leather-bound ledger, tied with a frayed ribbon and covered in a fine layer of dust. The spine bore only a hint of gold lettering, cannabis indica, cases and observations. Curiosity pricked at her like a pin, and she carefully untied the ribbon. The pages were filled with handwriting that seemed alive, careful, deliberate, and occasionally trembling with emotion. The first entries were clinical. Soldiers' tremors soothed, mothers' insomnia calmed, patients' hysteria eased. Each case was measured meticulously, doses noted, times recorded, reactions described. But as she turned the pages, the notes grew stranger. Patients were no longer only bodies to be healed. They were witnesses to their own relief, narrators of their own temporary peace. One entry read, "Patient reports dreams of distant fields, smiles in sleep, awakens restless but grateful." Another, "Soldier's hands no longer shake, eyes distant, as if touched by something unseen." Eleanor paused, her fingers hovering over the ink. The writing was not merely a record of medicine, it was a diary of experience, a catalogue of quiet transformations. She felt the faintest aroma of resin rising from the pages, though the ledger had been closed for decades. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, the memory of the plant itself. As she read further, she found notes scribbled in the margins, personal reflections from the doctor who had compiled the cases. "The plant heals the body," one read, "but the mind is left with echoes of what it once endured." Another, We give sleep, not peace. We give calm, not courage. The words struck her with a weight she had not anticipated. This was no longer medicine. It was history, preserved in the quiet voice of one man who had watched mercy work and feared what it left behind. Eleanor spent hours in the archives, transcribing pages, noting doses, patients' responses, and the subtle observations of the physician. She read about mothers who found comfort in the tincture, soldiers who trembled less, poets who dreamt, and women who laughed quietly after years of despair. She read about the paradox that haunted the empire. The same plant that had been praised as medicine in colonial lands had become feared at home. Safety and danger were not in the leaves themselves, but in the eyes of those who observed. When she finally closed the ledger, the room seemed quieter. The archivist beside her, who had been cataloguing medicinal herbs, looked up and asked if she had found anything of interest. Eleanor smiled faintly. "A whisper," she said, "a plant that once healed the empire and remembered it." Outside, the rain tapped against the windows like a rhythm of time passing. Inside, the ledger rested on her desk, open slightly, as though inviting her to continue listening. The empire had tried to forget, but in that archive, in the faint scent and the careful ink, the green leaf persisted, patient, secretive, and eternal. It waited for someone to read, to remember, to understand. The whisper was still there. All one had to do was lean close and listen. By 1907, the plant that had once traveled across oceans as a gift of medicine had become a forbidden whisper in polite society. The empire, meticulous in its devotion to law and order, had decided that cannabis, once hailed as a gentle healer, could no longer be trusted. Its tinctures disappeared from apothecaries, replaced by morphine, bromides, and chloral hydrate. Its reputation, cultivated over decades, had been rewritten overnight, from remedy to vice, from mercy to menace. In a quiet house in Bloomsbury, Dr. Samuel Faircroft, older now, his hair streaked with grey, his hands lined with years of both practice and observation, kept a small vial hidden beneath his desk. The amber liquid inside smelled faintly of earth and rain, a scent that carried with it memories of wards, apothecaries, and distant colonies. It was the same medicine he had once administered to soldiers trembling from fever, mothers racked with insomnia, poets who could not sleep for thought. He had sworn to himself that it was harmless when measured carefully. Yet now, in a city governed by suspicion, even his careful measure might be considered a crime. That afternoon, a young patient arrived, a woman named Margaret Calloway, thin and pale, her eyes shadowed by sleepless nights. She had been recommended by a mutual acquaintance, someone who remembered the plant's effects before the empire had grown fearful. "I've heard you can help," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Not with opiates, not with anything that destroys me, only something gentle." Faircroft hesitated, feeling the weight of decades pressing on his chest. The world had changed, Parliament had debated, newspapers had vilified, and the Home Office had quietly tightened regulations. The medicine that had once soothed the empire's nerves now carried the potential for scandal, yet he could not refuse her entirely. He uncorked the vial carefully and poured a few drops into warm water, the liquid glimmering like captured sunlight. Margaret drank, and within minutes, the tension in her shoulders eased. Her breathing slowed. She closed her eyes and let herself sink into a quietness that had been impossible for years. Faircroft watched, a mixture of relief and dread washing over him. This was what the plant could do. It could heal, it could calm, it could allow a soul to rest, and yet it could not protect itself from the empire's fear. That night, Faircroft wrote in his journal, "The medicine is harmless, yet the law does not see the patient. It sees only the threat, the foreign origin, the shadow of indulgence. What was once mercy is now forbidden, and we who administer it must do so in silence, as though committing sin." Outside, London's streets were slick with rain. Carriages rattled over cobblestones, and the air smelled of coal smoke and wet stone. Within the quiet house, a faint, earthy aroma lingered, the scent of something that had crossed oceans, survived empires, and now existed only in shadows and memory. Faircroft placed the vial back in its hiding place, the cork pressing against glass worn smooth by decades of handling. The plant's journey had brought it here, to this moment, not as a marvel, not as a menace, but as a forbidden truth. Somewhere, the empire had learned to fear comfort itself, and in that fear, the medicine remained patient, waiting for those who would remember its gentle promise, a secret green flame in a city that no longer trusted its light. The lecture hall in Westminster was filled with the stiff posture of men in black coats, collars starched, mustaches bristling like guards' pikes. It was a chilly morning in 1910, and the fog pressed against the tall windows, curling into the room with a damp chill that seemed almost deliberate. At the podium stood Reverend Jonathan Stokes, a figure of moral gravity, his eyes sharp, his voice rising and falling with the cadence of condemnation. The topic of the day, the foreign vices creeping into English homes, namely, the quiet use of cannabis, the tinctures and teas once praised by doctors but now seen as dangerous, unnatural and subversive. "Gentlemen," Stokes began, his tone both measured and fiery, "we find ourselves at a crossroads. The empire has conquered lands, commanded seas, and codified law. Yet now, in the heart of London, a quiet corruption threatens to erode the very spirit of our people." His finger tapped a ledger beside him. "This," he continued, "is not medicine. It is indulgence. It is a foreign poison disguised as benevolence, and it creeps from the hands of mothers to the lips of children and soldiers alike." In the back row, a young journalist scribbled furiously, capturing the rhythm and rhetoric. Stokes had been speaking for nearly an hour, quoting reports from India, testimonials from nurses, and a handful of newspaper articles from London itself. He described the languid steps of men softened by the tincture, dreams unholy in their nature, and women lulled into idleness. The words, though precise, were thick with fear. "We must recognize," he intoned, "that indulgence begins quietly. A drop here, a sip there, and soon the mind is dulled, the will weakened, the body enslaved." The crowd murmured their assent. Some had been following the debates in Parliament for years. Others were newcomers, eager to align themselves with the rising tide of moral authority. All nodded in agreement, convinced that civilization depended upon vigilance. Stokes paced slowly across the stage, the echoes of his shoes bouncing softly against the wooden floor. "It is our duty," he said, "to prevent the spread of these foreign habits. We must not rely on the vague promises of science or the discretion of apothecaries. Law must follow morality, and morality must be absolute." His eyes scanned the room, capturing every shoulder, every chin lifted in agreement. He was preaching not just to persuade, but to command a sermon disguised as argument. Outside, the city moved with the same indifferent rhythm it always had. Street vendors calling, carriages clattering, fog curling along the cobblestones. Within the lecture hall, however, a sense of urgency took hold, a belief that the empire itself was at risk from something as delicate as a green leaf. The moralists had cast the plant as a symbol, the exotic threat of the colonies, the hidden indulgence of polite society, the danger of mercy misapplied. By the afternoon, resolutions had been drafted, letters were sent to apothecaries, police inspectors, and members of Parliament, warning that cannabis, once medicine, once tolerated, must be monitored, restricted, or banned. Yet in quiet houses across the city, small green bottles still sat on mantels and bedside tables, patient, fragrant, and defiant. For all the sermons and threats, the plant had not disappeared. It waited, a quiet reminder that morality, like mercy, could not be contained by ink alone. And in the archives of Westminster, the voices of the moral reformers echoed, loud, sharp, and certain. But the faint scent of resin lingered, imperceptible to all but those willing to remember. And in that lingering scent, The forbidden medicine waited patiently for those who still understood its gentle promise. By 1913, the machinery of legislation had begun to turn decisively against cannabis. What had once been a quietly tolerated medicine, imported from India and prescribed with care, was now a subject of intense scrutiny in the Home Office. The bureaucrats in London, their faces pale under gaslight, debated endlessly over phrasing, clauses, and definitions. It was not enough to know the effects of the plant. The law demanded a story that could be measured, catalogued, and enforced. Sir Reginald Harcourt, senior counsel to the Home Office, sat at his desk piled high with bills, correspondence, and medical reports. He traced a finger along a line of type. No person shall possess, sell, or administer Indian hemp in any form, without license or special dispensation. The language was clean, absolute, and terrifyingly precise. To the untrained eye, it appeared as mere regulation, an administrative safeguard. But to those who had witnessed the quiet, healing power of cannabis, it was the first true erasure of an era. The debates that produced this law had been long and tense. Physicians like Dr. Ambrose and Dr. Halstead had written letters pleading for nuance, citing decades of observation. They noted that moderate use could calm the nerves, soothe pain, and ease insomnia effects praised by soldiers, mothers, and poets alike. Parliament listened politely, nodded occasionally, and then filed their reports away. Their decisions were never swayed by mercy. Law, they understood, existed to control, not to comfort. Across London, apothecaries braced themselves. The notices were clear. Tinctures, teas, powders, all now under license. Orders of the plant would be scrutinized. Unrecorded sales would be prosecuted. In many shops, the green glass bottles were quietly removed, replaced by morphine, bromides, or other legal remedies. Chemists, who had once sold the leaf for the relief of sleepless mothers and trembling veterans, now counted their risk in pounds and pence. One clerk in Soho murmured to a colleague, "It's not the plant they fear, it's the quiet that comes with it." In private homes, the effects were more subtle. Soldiers returning from India, mothers who had relied on tinctures for decades, poets who had found inspiration in the quiet of night, all were forced to hide their bottles, to ration drops, or to abandon them entirely. The law was not enforced evenly. The privileged could obtain permits, the working class could not, and yet the scent lingered faint, earthy, a reminder of what had once been permitted and understood. Sir Reginald drafted the law carefully, using language that left no ambiguity. Possession without authority is punishable by fine or imprisonment. Each word was measured, each sentence designed to anticipate loopholes. In the reading room, under the flickering gaslights, he sealed the document. Satisfied, the empire, he believed, had done its duty. Control had been codified, morality enforced, and a threat, however gentle, had been contained. But the law existed only on paper. Outside, in the alleys of Limehouse, in quiet parlours of Bloomsbury, and along the banks of the Thames, the plant persisted in memory, in small vials, in the faint aroma of leaves crushed and brewed. It had crossed oceans once to serve as medicine, and now, though forbidden, it had returned as whisper, as shadow, as a quiet rebellion that no statute could entirely erase. And so the paper law was written, absolute in ink, definitive in intent. Yet in London, in the quiet spaces between houses and behind closed doors, the green leaf remained patient, waiting, defiant, and still offering the mercy that the empire had declared illegal. By the late 1910s, the empire had grown forgetful, not entirely, not consciously, but gradually, silently, as if the act of remembering had become inconvenient. The plant that had once soothed soldiers' hands, quieted mothers' minds, and inspired poets' thoughts had vanished from apothecary shelves, medical journals, and even polite memory. Cannabis, once extractum indicae, now existed only as an echo, a footnote in the archives, a scent faintly traced in dusty papers. Dr. Charles Ambrose, now long retired, walked slowly through the streets of Bloomsbury, past the familiar shops and gas lamps, past the university where he had once lectured on the science of sleep. The world had changed. Morphine had replaced tinctures, bromides had replaced teas, and the quiet mercy of the green leaf had been supplanted by the efficiency of measurement. People slept, yes, but it was a sleep devoid of dreaming, a calm calculated to prevent error, discomfort, and, above all, memory. In the libraries of London, new generations of physicians studied anatomy and chemistry, pharmacology and procedure. The plant that had once been part of every medical discourse was no longer taught. It was referenced only as an exotic curiosity, a relic from the colonies, the memory of a practice that had been quietly excised from the textbooks. Students looked at its name with curiosity and contempt alike. They did not understand it, and so they dismissed it. The empire, in essence, had erased its own past. Yet in the quiet, in private homes, the memory persisted. A soldier who had returned from Burma kept a small bottle tucked behind his writing desk. A widow in Kensington would sometimes pour a drop into her tea, closing her eyes as if she were not drinking a remedy but inhaling a memory. Poets, hidden away in attics, still inhaled the faint smoke of crushed leaves, finding in it inspiration, not scandal. To them, the empire's laws mattered little. The plant's effects were timeless. Newspapers and moralists hailed the removal of cannabis from public life as a triumph. Editors wrote of progress, civilization, and moral clarity. Politicians praised the enforcement of order, the triumph of regulation over indulgence. Yet the scent persisted in the air of London, faint as it was, a reminder of what had been and what the empire had chosen to forget. Those who remembered did so quietly, almost fearfully, knowing that discussion could bring censure, ridicule, or worse. Dr. Ambrose, in his study one evening, opened a drawer and found a small green glass bottle, dusty and still faintly aromatic. He poured a single drop into water and tasted it. The bitterness was familiar, grounding, and strange. For a moment, he remembered the soldier's hand steadying, the mother's tears slowing, the poet's sighs of inspiration. He closed his eyes, and the world softened around him, if only briefly. Outside, London moved as it always had, fog curling along the streets, the click of boots on cobblestones, the smoke of factories rising toward a grey sky. The empire believed it had forgotten, but the plant, patient as ever, had survived in memory, in touch, in taste, a quiet rebellion against the machinery of law and time. And so the age of amnesia fell over the city, with the green leaf still waiting in hidden corners, whispering softly that mercy, once learned, cannot be entirely erased. By the early years of the 20th century, the empire's vast networks had begun to carry more than trade and governance across oceans. They carried memories, habits, and sometimes the illicit shadows of what had been exported. The plant that had once been sent from India as medicine, refined, bottled, and prescribed, now returned in quiet defiance, slipping through the same channels that had carried it decades before. Soldiers, officers, and travelers brought tinctures, powders, and leaves back with them, sometimes openly, often hidden in the folds of their luggage, their uniforms, or the pockets of plain coats. Lieutenant Thomas Whitaker returned from India in 1903, medals pinned neatly, uniform polished, but hands still shaking despite appearances. He had witnessed the chaos of disease, the tremor of malaria, and the endless suffering of men who could not rest. In the jungles of Punjab, the soldiers had discovered the plant's quiet power, drops of tincture that steadied nerves, soothed muscles, and carried a fleeting comfort to those who had none. Whitaker had relied on it himself, not recklessly, but for sleep, the kind of sleep that comes after days of fevered work and relentless anxiety. Now, back in London, he kept a small amber bottle, hidden in his study, alongside letters from his regiment, for emergencies only. The city itself was oblivious. London marched to the beat of industry and governance, unaware of the quiet rebellion returning with each shipment of the plant. The docks, the stations, the carriage houses all became points of transit for a memory that refused to be erased. Apothecaries had largely removed cannabis tinctures from public shelves. Morphine and bromides had taken their place. Yet the plant persisted in private homes, quietly restoring what society had declared forbidden. Halstead, across the Atlantic at Johns Hopkins, wrote to Ambrose in London about a similar phenomenon. Officers returning from India, Burma, and the African colonies reported discreet use of tinctures in their homes and among close companions. Families, long bereft of the gentle medicine, found small comfort in the same remedies that had soothed generations before. The letters read like a whispered defiance, a secret network of memory and mercy that flourished despite law and censure. In a modest home in Bloomsbury, a young woman named Margaret Calloway received a small vial of tincture from a returning soldier. She drank it carefully, only a few drops in warm water, and felt the tension of years slip from her shoulders. The world softened. The fog outside her window seemed less oppressive. For a few hours, she was free from pain, free from the relentless ticking of life and expectation. Outside, the Empire had declared war on the plant, but within her small room, it was mercy, quiet and undisturbed. The paradox was not lost on Whitaker. The Empire had exported the plant as medicine and then turned against it. Yet, its effects, quietly transmitted back across oceans, reminded those who remembered of its gentle power. It had survived bureaucracy, fear, and legislation, patient, resilient, and unbowed. At night, he would light the lamp, hold the vial to the light, and imagine the fields in India where it had been harvested, the hands that had tended it, and the men and women who had first learned to rely on it. The plant had returned to London not as defiance, but as memory, a reminder that mercy, once learned, cannot be confined by law or forgotten by those who have known it. And so, as fog rolled over the Thames and gas lamps flickered in the streets, the green leaf waited quietly in the city's hidden corners, a patient witness to the Empire's own contradictions, whispering that what was once healing could never truly be forbidden. The Royal College of Physicians had always been a repository of memory, a place where paper and ink recorded the Empire's triumphs and errors alike. Its walls, lined with shelves that reached the ceiling, were heavy with dust and the weight of knowledge centuries old. It was here, amid the brittle pages and the faint smell of decay, that Miss Eleanor Hawthorne made her discovery. She had come to catalogue medical journals, expecting the usual meticulous notes of anatomy, dosage, and procedural observation. Instead, she found a whisper, quiet, persistent, and faintly fragrant. Tucked behind a row of pharmacopoeias, a small leather-bound ledger caught her attention. Its spine, cracked with age, bore only traces of gold lettering: cannabis, indica, cases, and observations. Eleanor pulled it gently from the shelf, brushing away decades of dust. The pages were dense with handwriting, small, precise, and yet uneven at the edges, as if the author's hand had trembled with emotion. First entries were clinical, almost dull by modern standards. Soldiers' tremors reduced, mothers' insomnia eased, patients' hysteria calmed. Each note recorded dosage, timing, and response with meticulous care. But as she read on, the ledger grew strange, almost alive. Patients were not just bodies to be healed, they became narrators of their own quiet transformation. One entry read, "Patient dreams of distant fields, smiles in sleep, awakens restless but grateful." Another, "Soldier's hands no longer shake, eyes distant as if touched by something unseen." Eleanor paused, inhaling faintly. There was a scent in the air, subtle and earthy, the ghost of leaves crushed and brewed long ago. It was the lingering memory of the plant itself, resisting erasure. The margins contained personal reflections from the physician who had compiled the cases. The plant heals the body, but the mind is left with echoes of what it once endured. Another note: we give sleep, not peace. We give calm, not courage. Hours passed as Eleanor transcribed the pages, noting patient names, dosage, reactions, and the quiet musings of the doctor who had observed them. She read of mothers whose nights were restored, soldiers whose hands no longer trembled, poets who had dreamed for the first time in years, women who laughed softly after long despair. But interwoven with these accounts was the persistent awareness of the empire's fear, the fear that comfort might become corruption, that gentle relief might invite dependency, that mercy might be misinterpreted as indulgence. When she finally closed the ledger, the room felt quieter. The archivist beside her looked up, curious. "Found anything interesting?" he asked. Eleanor smiled faintly. "A whisper," she said. "A plant that once healed the empire and remembered it." Outside, rain tapped against the tall windows. Inside, the pages remained open, as if inviting her to continue listening. The empire had tried to forget, had written laws and decrees, had silenced voices. Yet in that archive, in the faint scent of resin and the careful ink, the green leaf persisted patient, secretive, eternal. It waited for someone to read, to remember, to understand. The whisper was still there. All one had to do was lean close and listen. And when Eleanor did, she could almost hear the quiet exhalations of centuries, the sighs of patients soothed, of doctors alarmed, of an empire that had learned to fear the mercy it once carried across oceans. By the second decade of the 20th century, cannabis had become a word whispered rather than spoken. Its tinctures, once displayed openly in apothecaries, now hid behind locks and drawers, administered only at the discretion of a few daring or desperate physicians. The empire had declared it dangerous, exotic, morally suspect. Yet in quiet homes, behind closed curtains, its presence lingered, the faint scent of earth, the memory of calm, the patient mercy that no law could fully erase. Dr. Samuel Faircroft, older now, walked the dim halls of his Bloomsbury practice, feeling the weight of decades pressing down upon him. The world outside had turned its back on the plant, favoring morphine, bromides, and chloral hydrate medicines that offered relief with precision, but no memory. He kept a small vial hidden beneath his desk, amber liquid sealed with a cork that had darkened with age. In that tiny bottle rested the remnants of decades of observation. Soldiers' trembling hands steadied, mothers' insomnia soothed, poets inspired. He alone knew that its effects were subtle, precise, and profoundly human. That afternoon, Margaret Calloway arrived, pale and exhausted, clutching a letter of recommendation from a friend who remembered the old ways. She had heard of the tincture, of its gentle efficacy, and begged for relief. Faircroft hesitated. The law, though vague, was unyielding, yet compassion, honed over decades of practice, outweighed caution. He uncorked the bottle and poured a few drops into warm water, the liquid glimmering faintly in the lamplight. Margaret drank carefully, closing her eyes as a warmth spread through her chest. Minutes passed, her breathing slowed, her shoulders, once tense with the unrelenting pressure of sleepless nights, relaxed. For the first time in months, perhaps years, she exhaled freely. The room was silent, save for the faint ticking of the clock. Faircroft watched, knowing he was committing a quiet defiance of law in the tense name of mercy. The plant had become forbidden, but its purpose had not changed. It still healed where modern remedies often fell short. It still quieted the restless mind and eased the body. Yet administering it carried risk, not of its effect but of discovery. Pharmacists had been cautioned, doctors warned. Society, convinced of its danger, ignored the centuries of careful observation, and the lives quietly improved. Later that evening, Faircroft recorded the session in his journal, careful to disguise names and locations. The medicine is gentle, as always. Its effect is subtle, yet profound. I administered it knowing the law may not approve. The world fears what it cannot measure. He closed the journal and returned the vial to its hiding place. Its scent, earthy and sweet, lingered in the air like a promise. Outside, London moved as it always had. Fog curling along cobblestones, horse-drawn carriages rattling through alleys, the city breathing in the smoke of industry and coal. Empire believed it had forbidden the plant, but mercy, patient as ever, endured in quiet rooms, behind locked doors, in the hands of those who remembered its gift. And so the forbidden medicine waited not in apothecaries, not in journals, not in the eyes of the fearful, but in the faintest moments of relief, in the quiet exhalations of those who had dared to find peace, and in the patient knowledge that no law could entirely erase what had once healed the empire. By the spring of 1915, London had grown accustomed to its own forgetfulness. The streets were dark with coal smoke, the river grey and sluggish under low clouds, and the city hummed with the relentless rhythm of industry and war. The empire had exported, legislated, and then forbidden cannabis, erasing it from apothecaries, medical journals, and polite society. Yet, despite law, progress, and collective amnesia, the plant persisted in memory, in practice, and in the faint, earthy scent that lingered in the corners of quiet rooms. In a small townhouse on Dean Street, a widow named Margaret Calloway poured the last few drops of a tincture into a teacup, inhaling the faint aroma that had become nearly extinct. The liquid shimmered amber under the dim lamplight. She sipped carefully, letting the warmth spread through her chest, easing the tension that had tightened her body for months. The empire had declared the medicine forbidden, but here, in this modest room, it persisted quietly, loyally, like a guardian of forgotten mercy. Across London, other vials lay hidden in desk drawers, behind false panels in cabinets, or in small leather pouches tucked beneath pillows. Soldiers returned from the colonies with memories in amber bottles. Mothers who had once relied on tinctures continued to administer them in secret. Poets, writers, and scholars inhaled crushed leaves to find inspiration, to quiet anxious minds, to remember the past. The law had erased the practice from public view, but the effect remained alive, carried by those who had experienced it. Dr. Samuel Faircroft, now frail with age, kept his own vial in a locked drawer beneath his desk. He often thought of the patients he had treated over decades, soldiers trembling from fever, mothers sleepless with worry, poets haunted by their own thoughts. Cannabis had eased their suffering where other medicines had failed, and though the empire had turned against it, he continued to administer it quietly. Each drop was measured carefully, not for profit or fame, but for mercy. In the Royal College of Physicians' archives, a leather-bound ledger lay forgotten, its pages yellowed and the ink faded. Case notes, patient observations, and the personal reflections of doctors who had once administered the medicine recorded the quiet lives it had touched. The plant had healed without notice, soothed without fanfare, and persisted despite fear. The empire could legislate its public absence, but it could not erase the memory, the scent, or the effect. Outside, London moved on, fog curling along the Thames, carriages rattling over cobblestones, church bells tolling across the city. Yet somewhere in its hidden rooms, behind closed doors and drawn curtains, the green leaf lingered. Its aroma rose faintly in the air, patient as ever, a whisper of what had been permitted, cherished, and then forbidden. It reminded those who remembered that mercy had not vanished, only been hidden, and so the smoke never left. It persisted in secret teacups, in small vials, in the faint amber glow of liquid resting in the lamplight. It survived in the quiet exhalations of patients soothed in the night, in the memories of doctors who administered it at risk to themselves, and in the hidden pockets of an empire that had once praised it and then condemned it. The world forgot, but the plant endured, patient, subtle, eternal. The city slept, fog pressing gently against windows, gas lamps flickering through the mist, and in that stillness, if one leaned close enough, one could smell the faint sweetness of a plant that had healed, comforted, and whispered across oceans and decades, waiting patiently for someone, anyone, to remember again.